The house is dark. Not dark the way a room is dark when someone forgets to switch on a lamp, but dark the way a house is dark at 4 in the morning in November in London, when the street outside holds nothing but cold air and the particular silence that comes just before the city remembers to start breathing again. And yet, something is moving. Not upstairs, where the family sleeps in rooms that will not be disturbed until the bell pulls are tugged at 8. Not in the dining room, where last night's cloth still lies smooth over the mahogany, the candlesticks standing in their places like sentinels who have long since ceased to expect anything of the dark. Somewhere else. Somewhere lower. Somewhere the family does not go. A door opens at the back of the house. The basement door, the one that faces not the street but the area, that narrow trench of cold stone sunk below the pavement, lit in daylight by a wedge of grey sky and at 4 in the morning by nothing at all. A figure steps through it. Small. Quiet. Moving with the particular efficiency of someone who has done this exact sequence of steps so many times that the body no longer requires the mind's permission to proceed. She is 14 years old. Her name is Ellen. She is the kitchen maid, which means she is the lowest-ranked female servant in this household of 7, which means she is the first one awake, which means the darkness and the cold belong to her in a way they belong to no one else in this building. She does not complain about this. It has not occurred to her to complain about this. She lifts the coal scuttle from beside the area steps, carries it inside, and descends to the kitchen, where the range will need to be raked and blacked and coaxed back to life before anyone upstairs opens an eye. The house above her sleeps on. It does not know she is here. That is rather the point. There is a house somewhere in your imagination, perhaps you have seen it in a film, or passed it on a street in Edinburgh or Bath or one of the Georgian squares of London, a tall narrow house of 4 or 5 stories, its front face composed and proper, its windows blank and respectable, its black-painted door centered precisely between 2 stone pillars. A house that means to tell you nothing, that has been designed from the very first brick to project an impression of quiet, self-contained dignity. What the house does not tell you, what it was never meant to tell you, is everything that is happening behind it. Below it. Inside the walls of it. In the passages and the back staircase and the basement kitchen and the attic rooms wedged under the eaves where the ceiling slopes so low a person of average height must duck to cross from the door to the bed. Between 1837 and 1901, the years of Queen Victoria's reign, domestic service was the single largest employer of women in Britain. At the peak of the Victorian era, there were roughly 1.3 million domestic servants working in English households alone, men and women both, though the ratio tilted heavily female, and if you gathered them all into one place, they would have formed a city larger than Birmingham. A city of people whose entire professional existence was organized around a single, non-negotiable principle: they must not be seen. This is the thing that stops me, every time I come back to it. Not the labor, though the labor was extraordinary. Not the hierarchy, though the hierarchy was intricate enough to require its own etiquette manuals, its own complex grammar of precedence and rank. What stops me is the invisibility. The fact that an entire class of people, living inside the same walls as the families they served, eating in the same house, sleeping in the same building, breathing the same air, were required, by custom and expectation and sometimes by explicit instruction, to move through that shared space as though they were not there. They developed a parallel world for this purpose. A world of back staircases and service corridors and basement passages and timed routines so precise that a housemaid could cross a hallway and vanish before a family member reached the landing. A world built inside the walls of the visible world, running alongside it, supporting it, making it possible, and kept, as much as architecture and custom could manage, entirely out of sight. Tonight we are going to step into that world. Not the parlor. Not the drawing room. The other half of the Victorian house, the half that kept the first half running, and was never supposed to be acknowledged. If you find yourself drifting as we go, that is exactly right. This story has no urgency. It moves at the pace of a well-run household, which is to say, steadily, quietly, with everything in its place. You are standing at the front door of a mid-Victorian townhouse in Kensington. The year is 1875. The door is black and freshly painted, its brass knocker polished to a shine that reflects your face back at you in miniature, slightly warped, surrounded by the grey November sky. The steps leading up to it are white stone. The whitening of those steps happens every morning before 7, on hands and knees, with a hearthstone and cold water, and they are clean enough to eat from. Now walk around to the side. Down the lane between this house and the next, toward the back. Notice how the architecture changes. The stone becomes brick, functional rather than decorative. The windows become smaller, their frames unpainted, their glass thicker and less clear. There are no polished fittings here, no pretense of elegance. There is a wooden gate set into the wall, unlatched, and beyond it a yard, a flagged, practical rectangle of space given over to coal storage and ash bins and a pump and lines for drying things that will be pressed before they go upstairs. And there, at the back of the house, below the level of the yard, descending 3 stone steps into the area, is the servants' entrance. The tradesman's door. The other door. The Victorian townhouse was, in its architecture, 2 houses occupying the same physical space. This was not accidental. It was engineered, deliberately, systematically, and with considerable ingenuity, to allow 2 different ways of life to coexist without ever quite having to acknowledge each other. The front of the house was what the family presented to the world, the public face, the drawing room floor, the entrance hall with its console table and its silver card tray and the particular quality of silence that expensive carpets produce. The back of the house, the kitchen quarters, the service stairs, the pantries and sculleries and coal cellars and larder, was what made the front possible. And the entire system was arranged to ensure that what made it possible remained, as far as possible, invisible. The genius of this arrangement, if genius is the word, was architectural. Builders of Victorian townhouses designed the servants' domain into the very structure of the building from the first drawing. The basement, which in earlier centuries had been used for storage or left as a cellar, became in the Victorian house a fully inhabited working floor, kitchen, scullery, butler's pantry, coal store, and in grander houses a servant's hall and a housekeeper's room. These rooms had windows, but the windows looked out onto the area, that sunken stone trench between the house wall and the pavement, and the area was separated from the street by iron railings. Light came down to the kitchen not as a gift but as a concession, a thin slice of grey sky at the top of the area wall. The kitchen quarters occupied the full footprint of the house. They were never small. A Victorian cook presided over a space that contained the range, a massive iron structure fed by coal, with ovens and hot plates and a boiler for hot water, the kitchen table, the dresser with its rows of copper pans, the scullery adjoining with its stone sink and its mangle, the larder with its marble shelf for meat, the dry goods store with its rows of canisters labeled in copperplate. These were working rooms of genuine functional scale. A dinner party for 12 required a kitchen with the capacity of a small restaurant. But no guest at that dinner party was supposed to think about the kitchen. They were not supposed to think about the range or the cook or the sequence of operations that had produced the 8 courses being set before them by white-gloved hands. The food was meant to appear. The house was meant to run. The mechanism was meant to be silent and smooth and hidden. Hence the back staircase. This is the feature of the Victorian house that most people know about in theory and almost no one has actually climbed, because in most of the surviving examples the back staircases have been sealed off or converted or stripped of everything that made them what they were. But in houses that have been preserved, the Geoffrey Museum in London, which is now the Museum of the Home, has several examples. The National Trust properties at Erdig in Wales and Lanhydrock in Cornwall are particularly intact. You can still find them, narrow, uncarpeted, plainly panelled, lit originally by a single gas jet at each landing and now usually by a bare bulb, steep-stepped and worn smooth at the centre from decades of feet going up and down, with laden trays and buckets of coal and baskets of laundry, before 7 in the morning and after 10 at night. The back staircase ran parallel to the main staircase, separated from it by a wall so thin that on quiet mornings you could hear the family's footsteps on the carpet above through the plaster. The 2 staircases shared the same building but moved through different versions of it. The main staircase was wide enough for a crinoline, its treads covered in Brussels carpet held down by brass rods, its balustrade polished mahogany, its light coming from the skylight above the stairwell. The servants' staircase was wide enough for one person carrying a tray. Its treads were bare wood, slightly gritty underfoot. Its walls were whitewashed. There was no balustrade, just a rope handrail, later replaced in some houses by a painted wooden rail. A housemaid working a house of 4 floors could walk those stairs a dozen times before the family came down for breakfast. Coal up to every fireplace, which in winter meant 6 or 7 grates on the upper floors, each needing to be raked and laid and lit before the family stirred. Slop pails down. Hot water cans up, the kind with a fitted lid to keep the water warm, one for each bedroom, each washstand, each dressing table. The weight of those cans on the back staircase in the dark at 6:30 in the morning is one of the small, specific, unremarkable facts of Victorian domestic life that I find impossible to pass over quickly. The house above slept on. The household below was already in full motion. There was another invisible infrastructure running through the Victorian house, one even less visible than the back staircase, the system of bells. Before electric bells became common in the 1880s and 1890s, the wire and spring bell system had been the household central nervous system for half a century. Every room in the family's portion of the house had a bell pull, a velvet or woven rope mounted beside the door or the fireplace, or sometimes recessed into the skirting board. The rope connected via a series of wires and cranks, threading through the walls and under the floors, to a row of bells mounted in the servants' passage or the kitchen corridor. Each bell had a different tone, and each was labeled above a small brass indicator showing which room it came from: drawing room, morning room, library, master bedroom. Each bell had its own arc of swing. The indicator swung when the bell rang and went on swinging for a moment after, so that even in a corridor full of noise you could tell at a glance which room wanted attention. A skilled housemaid, a butler who had been in service for 20 years, could read those swinging indicators as naturally as reading a sentence. The bells were rung for everything and nothing. More coal for the fire. Another cup of tea. The front door, a visitor. A message to be taken. An instruction to be given. The bells rang at all hours, and someone had to answer every ring, and the answering of them defined the basic rhythm of service. Wait, respond, vanish. Wait, respond, vanish. This was the essential pattern. The family had a need. The servant appeared, addressed it, and was gone before the need could become an awareness of the mechanism that had addressed it. The ideal servant, in the Victorian conception, was one who had so thoroughly mastered this pattern that their presence ceased to register. Not that they were ignored, though sometimes they were, but that the household had been so thoroughly arranged to absorb their movement that they had become, functionally, part of the house itself. Like the hot water that arrived at the washstand. Like the fire that was always burning. Like the air that moved through the rooms without anyone watching it go. There is a word for this in the Victorian household management literature. It is the word noiseless. The best servants were noiseless, not merely quiet, but noiseless, which was a different and higher standard. A servant who was merely quiet could still be heard on the stairs, could still be sensed in a doorway, could still create the slight disturbance of consciousness that comes when another human being enters your peripheral vision. A noiseless servant had moved beyond this. A noiseless servant had learned to move through a house the way water moves through a pipe, present, functional, and completely without impact on anything beyond the immediate task. The Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, published in 1861 and revised many times after, is the most famous household management manual of the Victorian era and the one most people have heard of, though it is rarely read carefully. Mrs. Beeton was 23 when she began writing it and 25 when it was published. She died at 28. What she produced in those brief years was not a cookbook, though it contains more than 900 recipes, but a comprehensive system for the management of domestic life, including detailed guidance on the management of servants, which she approached with the same methodical precision she applied to a recipe for lobster bisque. Her instructions to servants are interesting precisely because of what they take for granted. She does not explain why servants should not be seen. She does not argue for the principle. She instructs around it as around a fixed natural law, the way you instruct a gardener around the direction of sunlight, not something to be questioned, but something to be worked with. The housemaid should dust before the family comes downstairs. The footman should answer the door before the bell has rung twice. The parlor maid should be in and out of a room while it is occupied without drawing attention to the fact of her presence. These were not cruel instructions. They were not issued from cruelty or contempt, though contempt was certainly present in some households and certain eras. They were issued from a system that had developed its own coherent logic, a logic that said, the smooth operation of this household depends on the separation of its two worlds, and that separation depends on everyone knowing their place in the architecture, which side of the wall they inhabit, which staircase they use, and how completely they can master the art of being present without being there. It is a thing I find myself coming back to, when I let myself sit with it quietly. The idea that a house could be arranged so precisely around the need to not acknowledge certain people that it built that non-acknowledgement into its very walls. Into the angle of the back staircase. Into the depth of the basement. Into the swing of a bell indicator and the creak of a service door. The architecture was the attitude. The building was the belief. And yet the people who climbed those stairs and answered those bells and moved through those service corridors were not abstractions. They were Ellen, the kitchen maid, 14 years old, carrying coal before the city woke. They were people with names and histories and specific exhaustions and the occasional moment of quiet in the scullery when the water was boiling and the cook had not yet come down and the morning was still theirs for a minute. They were the largest occupational group in Victorian Britain, and they were, by design, the least visible. We are going to make them visible now. We have all night to do it, and nowhere else to be, and the house is very quiet. There is a table in the servants' hall, if the household is grand enough to have a servants' hall, which is itself a statement about the household size and the family's income, and the seating at that table is not negotiable. Not on the first day or the last day, not because of personality or preference or who happens to sit down first. The seating at the servants' hall table is fixed by rank, and the rank is as precisely calibrated as anything to be found in the dining room above. The butler sits at the head. He is the senior male servant, the man who controls the wine cellar and the plate and the male staff and the presentation of the household to the outside world. He has his own pantry, a small room lined with shelves for the silver, where he also sleeps when the house is small, though in grander establishments he has a sitting room as well, a room of his own that acknowledges his status as something more than a servant in the ordinary sense. He dresses as a gentleman. He speaks to the family as the family's representative among the servants, and to the servants as the family's voice. His coat is black. His deportment is impeccable. He has spent decades achieving both. The housekeeper sits at the foot. She is the senior female servant, the woman who controls the female staff and the linen and the household accounts and the store cupboard with its locked door and the keys, always worn at her waist or kept in the pocket of her black dress, that give access to the tea and the sugar and the spirits and the preserved fruits. She is addressed, regardless of her actual marital status, as Mrs. This is not a kindness. It is a courtesy title, a professional designation that acknowledges her seniority in the same way that the butler's black coat acknowledges his. Between these two poles sits everyone else, in strict descending order of precedence. The lady's maid, who is personal to the mistress of the house and therefore elevated above the ordinary domestic ranks, she dresses hair and mends lace and accompanies the mistress on visits and is the only servant who regularly spends extended time alone with a family member, which gives her a peculiar and sometimes delicate position in the household's social politics. The cook, who is a specialist and therefore powerful in a different register, her power resting not on social rank but on indispensability. A household that loses its cook is a household that cannot function, a fact the cook is never unaware of. The footmen, ranked among themselves by height, since footmen in livery were part of the household's visual presentation to visitors and a taller footman was simply more impressive in the entrance hall. The housemaids, ranked by length of service, the upper housemaid senior to the under housemaid senior to the kitchen maid senior to the scullery maid. And below the scullery maid, the boots, when there was a boots, a boy or young man whose primary responsibility was cleaning the family's shoes, which in a household of 8 people who changed their shoes 3 times a day was not a trivial occupation, and running errands and doing whatever tasks the hierarchy above had not claimed for itself. The precision of this ranking system would be comic if it were not quite so serious. A Victorian household management manual from 1895 provides a seating chart for the servants' hall that is almost mathematical in its attention to precedence, noting not merely who sits where but what forms of address are used between different ranks, which servants may speak directly to the family and which must communicate through a senior servant, and which servants may use the servants' hall at all times and which may enter only at mealtimes. The upper servants, butler, housekeeper, cook, lady's maid, valet, withdrew after the first course of the servants' dinner to eat the rest of their meal in the housekeeper's room. This was called, in the slightly arch language of the household, pug's parlor, a term of obscure origin that had been in use since the early 19th century and that everyone used without quite knowing where it came from. The upper servants' withdrawal to the housekeeper's room was not for privacy in any modern sense, it was another expression of the same hierarchical principle that governed everything else. They had earned the right to eat apart. They used it. The lower servants remained at the servants' hall table. They were served by the kitchen maid from the same dishes that the upper servants had been eating from in the first course, the same food, the same portion, nothing withheld, and they ate it in the company of one another, which was in some ways a freer arrangement. The upper servants had the better room and the greater authority. The lower servants had, occasionally, a less watched hour. I want to pause here on something that the rank table obscures if you look at it only as a chart. The servants in a Victorian household were not, for the most part, strangers to one another. They lived together. They ate together. They shared attic bedrooms, in some cases 2 or 3 to a room, and in very large establishments they had beds in dormitory arrangements that gave no more privacy than a school. They worked in the same rooms, used the same passages, passed each other 100 times a day in the kitchen and the corridor and on the back staircase. They were, in a meaningful sense, a community. A community with rigid internal politics, certainly. With jealousies and alliances and the particular frictions that develop when people cannot escape one another. But a community nonetheless, and one that was in many ways more intimate than the family upstairs, because the family could retreat to their separate rooms and their separate lives and their separate drawing-room evenings, while the servants lived in close proximity for the entirety of their working lives, which in long-service households could mean decades. The cook at Erdig in Wales, a property that the National Trust preserves with unusual attention to its servant history, worked in the same kitchen for over 40 years. 40 years. She outlasted 3 generations of the York family she served. She knew the house's smell in every season, the particular way the kitchen range drew in cold weather, the spot on the scullery floor where water collected when it rained. She was, in any practical sense, more intimate with that house than anyone who owned it. The wages these people were paid varied considerably by rank, period, and region, but the broad picture is worth sitting with. A cook in a wealthy London household in 1880 might earn between £25 and £50 a year, depending on skill and the scale of the entertaining. A butler might earn between 30 and 60. A housemaid might earn 12 to 18. A kitchen maid 8 to 12. A scullery maid 6 to 8. These figures include board and lodging. The servants lived in the house, ate from its provisions, were clothed in some cases by their employer's provision of uniforms, and £1 in 1880 is roughly equivalent to something between £80 and £100 in modern money, so the purchasing power is not quite as modest as the raw figures suggest. But purchasing power is not the whole picture. The scullery maid earning £6 a year was earning it for work that began at 5:30 in the morning and did not end until 10 at night, with short breaks for meals. She had 1 half-day free per week, usually Sunday afternoon, and 1 full day free per month if the household was generous. She could not leave the house without the housekeeper's permission. She could not receive visitors in the house. She could not, in most households, keep a follower, a sweetheart, and if discovered to have one would risk dismissal. She wore a uniform. She ate what she was given. She slept in the room assigned to her. In exchange, she had a guaranteed roof, guaranteed food, and the security of employment in a period when the alternative for a young woman from a working-class family with no other resources was factory work, or piecework, or the even grimmer margins of urban poverty. This was not a choice between freedom and constraint. It was a choice between varieties of constraint and service, for all its rigid hierarchy and invisible labor and near-total subordination of personal life to the household's requirements, offered a form of physical security that the alternatives often did not. This is the context that makes the Victorian servant's life both comprehensible and, once you understand it fully, quietly devastating. They were not slaves, which is a distinction that mattered enormously to everyone involved, including the servants themselves. They were paid. They had legal protections, modest but real. They could leave, with proper notice, usually a month, and in theory find a position elsewhere. But the conditions of that employment, the complete absorption of their daily lives into the household's requirements, the invisibility that was not incidental but structural, the physical presence in the same building as the family and the simultaneous social non-existence, these were not incidental features of the job. They were the job. A footman in a large London household in 1870 gave an account, preserved in an oral history collection at the British Library, of his working day that I find both extraordinary and in retrospect entirely unsurprising. He was on duty from 7 in the morning until midnight, with a break of 2 hours in the afternoon if the family was not at home and 3/4 of an hour for his own dinner. He answered the door, waited at table, carried coals and cleaned boots and polished silver and laid and cleared and washed and put away. He did these things 6 days a week, and on Sundays he did a lighter version of the same things. He had been doing this since he was 17. He was then 34. He did not describe his life as hard. He described it as regular. This is the word that appears most often in servant testimony from the Victorian period, regular. The days were regular. The work was regular. The routine was regular. And regular, in the particular vocabulary of a life that had very little else to offer by way of anchor, was not a complaint. It was a description of something that, in its own way, held. The hierarchy was part of what held it. The clear ranking, the known precedences, the established forms of address and authority, these were not merely constraints. They were also structures, and structures, even confining ones, provide a kind of orientation. In a world with very few other forms of social stability available to a young woman from the country or a young man from a Midlands town, knowing exactly where you stood in the household, knowing that if you worked hard and behaved well you might in time become an upper housemaid or a cook or, in the distant possibility of a long career, a housekeeper, was not nothing. It was, in its own constrained way, a future. It was also, of course, a future that required you to remain invisible. To move through a house full of people and leave no impression. To do your work so thoroughly and so quietly that the people whose comfort depended entirely on your labor never had to think about it for a moment. To be there, entirely there, and somehow at the same time to have managed, for their purposes, not to be there at all. The table in the servants' hall holds them all. The butler at the head. The housekeeper at the foot. Ellen, the kitchen maid, near the lower end, eating her dinner quickly because there are still pots to be washed and the range to be checked and the morning's work to be laid out before she can sleep. The house above is quiet. The family is in the drawing room. The piano is playing something, faintly audible through the floors. The table conversation is, for this hour, their own. If you are settling in now, if the world outside has grown a little quieter and the day has begun to release its hold on you, subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The hour between 5 and 6 in the morning belongs, in a Victorian household, to no one the family would recognize as a person with a morning. It belongs to process. To the resumption of invisible labor after the brief suspension of the night. It belongs to Ellen, and to the under-housemaid whose name is Mary, and to the kitchen maid who comes in daily from the street 2 doors down, whose name is Bessie, who is 17 and comes from a village in Somerset and has been sending 6 shillings home to her mother every month since she started here. The first task, before anything else, is the range. The kitchen range in a Victorian household is the large iron cooking apparatus that occupies most of one wall of the kitchen and is the source of heat for everything. The cooking, the hot water, the warming of the kitchen itself in winter, which is particularly important because the kitchen is in the basement and basements are cold in ways that the upper floors of the house never quite are. The range must be lit by 6. If the range is not lit by 6, the boiler does not heat in time for the family's hot water. If the family's hot water is not ready by 8, the housemaid arriving at the bedroom doors with the copper cans will arrive with water that is merely warm, which is a failing of the kind that is noticed and mentioned and, if it happens again, recorded in a small careful way that will matter at the end of the year. The range was banked the night before, its fire reduced to a bed of hot embers covered with ash to hold the heat through the night, a technique that made it possible to restart in the morning without starting entirely from scratch. Ellen lifts the iron cover from the firebox, rakes the old ash away from the live embers, lays small pieces of coal over them in the way she was taught, and waits. The embers catch the new coal. The fire begins to breathe. She adds more coal, carefully, not too much, not so fast that the fresh coal smothers the flame, because the range requires a particular kind of attentiveness, not constant watching but a readiness to watch, a background awareness of the fire state that she has developed over 2 years until it sits somewhere below conscious thought. While the range builds, she blacks it. The blacking is a paste of black lead, graphite combined with a small amount of oil, that is applied with a brush to all the iron surfaces of the range that are not in use as cooking surfaces. This keeps the iron from rusting and gives the range its deep, light-absorbing black finish that is the visual signature of a well-run Victorian kitchen. The brush strokes must be circular, must not leave streaks, must achieve an even coat on the complicated surfaces of the range, the embossed decorative panels, the edges of the doors, the curves at the corners of the firebox opening. When the blacking is done, it is buffed with a second, clean brush until it shines. The range, at the end of this process, is almost beautiful. It is certainly well tended, which is the Victorian household substitute for beauty in the working rooms. The blacking smells of metal and oil. Its smell gets into the skin of your hands no matter how carefully you wash them afterward. Ellen's hands, at 14, already show the early calluses of range tending on the palms and the inner fingers, and they have a faint ingrained darkness around the cuticles that cold water and carbolic soap will reduce but never quite eliminate. While Ellen tends the range, Mary has gone upstairs with a bucket of coal for each of the main reception rooms. The fires in the drawing room and the morning room and the dining room and the library are not lit yet. The family will not come down to these rooms until 8:30 or 9, and a fire set too early will have burned to a disappointing state by then. But they must be laid now, the ash raked from the previous day's grate, the grate cleaned and polished with black lead, the paper and the kindling and the coal arranged in the precise configuration that will take a match quickly and cleanly. When the time comes. The timing of this sequence is exact. Lay the fire, clean the grate, polish it, set the coal. Then leave. The room must be restored to perfect order before any member of the family conceivably descends. The word that the Victorian household management literature uses for this sequence is preparation. The servant's morning is entirely a preparation, a making ready, a setting in order, a laying of groundwork for the family's day that must be complete and invisible before the family's day begins. Everything that happens in the servant's morning is oriented toward this vanishing. The work done, the worker gone, the room in its proper state of apparently effortless readiness as though no human effort had been involved in producing it at all. There is a passage in a memoir by a woman who had been a housemaid in a large Wiltshire house in the 1890s. The memoir was compiled by an oral historian in the 1950s, when she was in her 70s, and it has the quality of memory that has been carried a long time without being allowed to set down. in which she describes the particular quality of the morning before the family came down. She calls it her time. She says it with a kind of rueful affection, an acknowledgement that the designation is paradoxical. It is her time precisely because there is no one to claim it from her, and the moment anyone from above stairs descends, the time ceases to be hers in any sense, but that within the paradox it was real. The empty rooms, the polished grates, the particular quality of winter light coming down through the area window into the kitchen while the range finally begins to radiate warmth. Her time. The preparation of the breakfast room was the most precisely choreographed part of the morning. In households where a parlour maid or footman laid the table, this was done between 7:30 and 8, and the sequence was fixed: first the cloth, then the silver, then the china, then the glasses, then the morning newspapers ironed flat to remove the ink smell and folded to the front page at the right side of each cover, then the condiments, then the small flowers or greenery from the kitchen garden if the season permitted. Each item had its place. The spacing between pieces of cutlery was not approximate, it was measured, not always with a ruler but by the muscle memory of hands that had laid this table hundreds of times until the distances were absorbed into the body. A Victorian household manual from 1888 provides a diagram of the correct laying for a family breakfast for 6, including the precise angle at which the knife should rest relative to the table edge and the number of inches between the edge of the plate and the edge of the table. This is not unusual. The manuals of this period are full of such diagrams. They represent an attitude toward the physical world, toward the arrangement of objects in space, that treats tidiness not as a preference but as a moral category. An incorrectly laid table is not merely inconvenient. It is, in some quiet way, a failure of a larger kind. It suggests that the household is not properly ordered. And the household must always be properly ordered. The smell of a Victorian household in the early morning has no modern equivalent. It is a mixture of coal smoke from the freshlit fires and the range, of beeswax polish on the hall floor and the furniture in the reception rooms, of cold damp from the basement where the stone walls never quite dry in winter, of starch from the table linens that have been pressed overnight and are now slightly warm still from the iron, of the faint animal smell of lamp oil from the oil lamps that have not yet been replaced by gas throughout the house. Of tea, from the kitchen, where the first pot of the morning has been made for the upper servants. Of toast, faintly, from the range where Ellen has put the bread to warm. This smell is not romantic in any conventional sense. It is practical. It is the smell of work, of the physical effort of maintaining a large Victorian house in the condition that its inhabitants expect. But it is also, and this is the thing that the memoirs and the oral histories keep returning to, unprompted, it is also the smell of mornings. Of the beginning of the day before the day has been given to anyone else. Of the particular, unrepeatable quality of a house that is your charge and your responsibility and, in some sense that the hierarchy cannot quite reach, your home. By 7 o'clock, the range is fully lit and maintaining its heat. The reception rooms are prepared. The breakfast table is laid, or nearly so. The copper cans of hot water are warming on the range's top plates, ready to be carried up at 7:30, careful on the back staircase, careful at the turn on the first landing where the ceiling is low and a full can at arm's length requires a particular sideways step that every housemaid learns within her first week. The family sleeps on. They will not, for another hour, have the slightest awareness of any of this. Their rooms are warm because the fires were laid and lit. Their hot water will arrive at precisely the right temperature because someone calculated the time needed for the range to heat it and adjusted the morning sequence accordingly. Their newspapers will be ironed and folded, their table laid, their toast warming, their household in the state of impeccable readiness that they have paid for and that they consider, in some half-formed way, to be simply the natural condition of a well-run life. They are not wrong that it is well-run. They are wrong, or rather, they are allowed to be wrong, about what makes it so. The wrongness is structural. The system is designed to produce precisely this impression, that the house runs itself, that the fires light themselves, that the hot water arrives by some domestic magic unconnected to the figure who carried it up 3 flights of uncarpeted back staircase at 6:45 in the morning while the family's dreams were still unremarkable and warm. The system is designed to absorb all evidence of its own operation. And it does this so thoroughly, year after year, household after household, across the length of the Victorian era, that it becomes not merely a set of practices but a reality, a self-evident truth that people of a certain class genuinely experience as the natural order of things. There is a line in an 1885 letter from a Lady Hartley to her sister, preserved in a county archive in Gloucestershire, that I keep returning to because it captures something essential about the quality of this blindness. She is writing about a difficulty she has had with her housekeeper, who has given notice after 13 years. The difficulty is not moral or financial, she describes the housekeeper in warm terms. The difficulty is practical, because she cannot quite imagine how the house will function without her. I confess, she writes, I have never thoroughly understood how all of it is done. 13 years. She has inhabited this house for 13 years, in its daily fullness, and she has never thoroughly understood how all of it is done. She is not embarrassed by this admission. She does not appear to recognize it as a gap of any particular significance. The not knowing is built into the system with the same care as the back staircase and the bell pulls and the servant's entrance that faces away from the street. You are not supposed to know. Knowing would require seeing. And seeing would disturb the arrangement that makes the whole thing possible. The morning before the house wakes is almost over. The clock on the kitchen mantel shows 7:20. Ellen fills the copper cans from the range boiler, lifts the first one, and turns toward the back staircase. The treads are worn smooth at the center. The single gas jet at the first landing has been turned low. She knows this staircase by feel now, by the particular resistance of each tread under her foot, by the sound the landing makes when she steps on its slightly uneven board. She goes up. The house goes on, smoothly, invisibly. The morning carries on becoming the day. The rules were not written down in one place. This is the first thing to understand about them. They did not exist as a single document, a code that was handed to a servant on their first day and explained comprehensively before they began. They were transmitted the way a great many things in Victorian life were transmitted, through demonstration, through correction, through the accumulated unspoken expectations of a household that had been running for years before you arrived and would go on running after you left. You learned them by doing them wrong and being corrected. You learned them by watching the upper housemaid and doing what she did. You learned them by the expression on the housekeeper's face when you crossed the hall at the wrong moment, or spoke when you were not spoken to, or failed to turn toward the wall when the master passed you on the landing. The turning toward the wall. This is one of the rules that stops people most completely when they encounter it for the first time, because it is so concrete, so spatial, so bodily in its demand. In many Victorian households, particularly larger ones, and particularly in the earlier decades of the era, a servant encountering a member of the family in a corridor or on a staircase was expected to stop, step to the side, and face the wall. Not to look down. Not to stand aside with eyes lowered in the manner of a respectful but visible acknowledgement. To face the wall, so that the family member could pass without the discomfort of meeting a servant's eyes. The discomfort of meeting a servant's eyes. It is worth sitting with that phrase for a moment, because it tells you something about the nature of the arrangement that no amount of description about architecture and hierarchy quite captures. The eyes were the problem. The eyes were where the system became complicated, where the invisibility that the architecture and the routine and the timing were all designed to produce could be undone in a second, by a look. A look meant acknowledgement. Acknowledgement meant recognition. And recognition meant that the person you were looking at was a person, not a mechanism, not a function, not an aspect of the household's smooth operation, but an actual human being who was currently in the same physical space as you and was looking at you. This was the thing the system was designed to prevent. Not because the families were universally cruel, many were not, but because the entire operation of the household depended on a certain quality of non-awareness that direct eye contact immediately dissolved. So the rule was, face the wall. Step aside, turn your body, present your back, wait for the footstep to pass. It was codified in some households as explicitly as the rules about the grate or the laying of the table. It was understood everywhere else as the kind of thing that simply went without saying. There is an account by a housemaid named Agnes in a memoir of Victorian domestic service compiled by Frank Dawes in the 1970s, drawing on oral history interviews with women who had been in service in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods. Agnes was 13 when she went into service, and her first week was governed almost entirely by the terror of doing the wrong thing in a corridor. She had not been told about the wall-facing rule before she started. She encountered it by doing it wrong. She was carrying a tray of china through the main hall when the mistress of the house came down the main staircase, and Agnes looked up. The mistress did not say anything. The housekeeper mentioned it that evening, in the quiet, precise way that housekeepers had of mentioning things that were not to happen again. Agnes was not angry about this, or she was not angry in the way the telling of it might lead you to expect. She describes it with a kind of philosophical resignation that comes through even across the distance of 60 years. That was how it was. You learned. You did not look. You turned toward the wall. And once you had learned, the rule was simply part of the room, part of the house's grammar, like the correct form of address for different ranks or the proper way to knock on a door and wait for the response before entering. Not speaking unless spoken to was the other foundational rule, and it was in some ways more complex in its application than the wall facing, because it admitted of more edge cases. A servant carrying out an instruction obviously had to speak in the execution of that instruction, to confirm it, to ask for clarification if something was unclear, to report back when it was done. A servant bringing a message had to deliver the message. The rule was not an absolute prohibition on speech. It was a prohibition on the kind of speech that would establish the servant as someone with opinions, preferences, reactions, as someone, in other words, whose interior life was present and legible and capable of impinging on the family's consciousness. In practice, this meant no volunteered comments. No responses to overhearing that indicated you had heard. No visible reactions to what happened in the room, no startled expressions when raised voices indicated a domestic disagreement, no flicker of amusement when something amusing occurred in conversation above the servant's social register, no evidence of sympathy when someone was crying, no acknowledgement that you were witnessing anything at all beyond the specific task you had entered the room to perform. This was a discipline of the face as much as of the voice. The experienced servant had learned to compose their features into a kind of professional neutrality, not blankness, exactly, but a readiness without expression, an alertness without reaction. A footman waiting at table during a dinner party might overhear considerable private information about the family's affairs, their finances, their marriages, their health, their quarrels. He heard it because he was there, and he was there because the dinner had to be served, and the serving was invisible, and the invisibility included the fact of his hearing. What he heard was, in theory and often in practice, never repeated. The confidentiality of the serving role was understood, and enforced, in the sense that a servant known to gossip about the family's private affairs would not remain employed for long. But it was not merely strategic discretion. The ideal was more thorough than that. The ideal was that the servant had so thoroughly internalized the non-person status of their position that what they heard while performing their duties did not register as the kind of information that needed protecting, because it had never quite been received as information in the first place. You were not there. You heard nothing. There is nothing to keep silent about. I want to be careful here about the gap between the ideal and the reality, because the ideal is so extreme and the reality was, of course, far more human. Servants did hear. They did remember. They did, in the privacy of the kitchen and the servants' hall and the attic bedrooms, talk among themselves about what happened above stairs. The servants' hall was not a sealed chamber of discretion. It was a community of people who spent their lives at close quarters with a family and who were, beneath the professional discipline, entirely human in their curiosity and their judgment and their occasional satisfaction when something they had privately predicted came to pass. The eavesdropping, if we want to call it that, though the word implies more agency than a footman waiting at table usually had, was in many cases the only window the servants had onto the reasoning behind their own lives. Why the household was cutting costs. Why the master seemed preoccupied. Why the mistress had been unwell for several weeks. Why the family was considering a summer in the country this year when they usually went to the seaside. This information mattered, practically, to people whose security of employment depended on the household's financial health and the family's goodwill. You could not ask. You could not be told. You learned what you learned by the invisible permeability of walls and the fact that voices carry, especially when no one is thinking about who might be listening. There was a rule about doors, too. A servant entering a room in which a family member was present knocked, waited for a response, entered only partway until the family member indicated they might proceed, completed their task with the minimum possible disturbance, and exited backward if entering to address the master or mistress directly, turning one's back to leave being considered a degree of informality inconsistent with the proper maintenance of the distance. Exiting backward. This is another of the rules that stops people, because it seems simultaneously absurd and telling. The forward-facing exit required by a servant withdrawing from the presence of a social superior is the same gesture as withdrawing from royalty, and this is not a coincidence. The Victorian household borrowed its architecture of respect from the court, from the elaborate formal protocols that governed approaches to the monarch, and applied them in a domestic setting to govern the relationship between employer and employed. The distance it maintained was not merely social. It was spatial, physical, embodied in the angle of the body and the direction of the face. Some households were strict about these rules and some were not, and the variation was significant and the servants knew it. A household with a lenient mistress, one who spoke easily to the servants, who called them by their first names rather than the household-assigned names that some families gave to all servants holding a particular position regardless of their actual name. The housemaid is always Mary, who knocked before entering the kitchen, who inquired about a servant's health when they had been ill, was a household in which the formal rules relaxed by degrees without ever formally relaxing, in which the quality of daily life was meaningfully different from a household where the rules were strictly maintained. The servant knew this. They could not say so directly. But they chose positions accordingly, when choice was available, and they stayed in lenient households longer, and they remembered them differently in old age, with a warmth that said something about what the daily quality of acknowledgement had meant, even when it could not be named as acknowledgement or asked for as such. There is a word that appears in servant testimony from this period whenever this quality is being described, and the word is considered. A considerate mistress. A considerate household. The consideration being referred to is not primarily generosity in the financial sense, though that matters too. It is the quality of being treated as though you were, in some small way, a person, as though the fact of your presence in the house was attended to rather than organized away. As though the wall-facing rule, on some mornings, in some houses, was simply not enforced. Not enforced is not the same as not existing. The rule remained. The architecture remained. The back staircase and the servant's entrance and the bell pull and the invisibility as a system, all of it remained. But consideration was the small daily variation within the system that made it possible to live inside it with something other than pure endurance, and the servants who experienced it knew it, and the servants who did not experience it knew that too. The morning wears on. The family comes down to breakfast. The whole is correct. The fires are burning. The newspaper is folded at the master's place. Mary is in the kitchen corridor, waiting just out of sight in the way that good parlor maids learn to wait, present without being present, ready without being visible. Ellen is at the range, doing something with the breakfast eggs that requires her complete attention. A bell rings in the corridor. The dining room bell. Mary moves without hurrying toward the door. She is not rushing. She is not performing urgency. She has learned, as all good servants learn, that the correct response to a bell is something between prompt and smooth, fast enough to demonstrate attentiveness, unhurried enough not to suggest that the family has created any disturbance. She reaches the door. She knocks. She waits. She enters. The house works as it is meant to. The mechanism is invisible. The morning proceeds. A housemaid's day in a large Victorian household in the 1880s was, if you laid it out as a list of tasks, almost incomprehensible in its length. Not because any single task was beyond ordinary human capacity, the tasks were simple enough, but because the aggregate of them, performed daily without variation, beginning before the city woke and ending after the city had gone to quiet, represented a commitment of physical energy that the modern working day does not quite have a frame for. Let us go through it. Not to catalogue suffering, the women who performed these tasks did not for the most part experience their days as catalogues of suffering, and it would be presumptuous to impose that frame on them, but because the inventory itself is illuminating. Because the texture of the day tells you things about what mattered in a Victorian household that no amount of description from the family's perspective can quite convey. Before 6, range. The kitchen maid, who has often been awake since 5 or earlier, has the range burning. The housemaid's morning begins with the bedroom fires, or, in households where fires are not lit in the bedrooms until later, with the reception rooms. The sequence is always downstairs first if the reception rooms are used at breakfast, upstairs first if the family sleeps late and the bedrooms take priority. The housemaid knows which. 6 to 7, the bedroom floor. Slop pails carried down the back staircase. Each bedroom has a washstand with a basin and a pail for the used water from the previous evening's washing, and these must be emptied and rinsed and returned before the family wakes. The water is heavy. The pails slosh slightly if not carried with perfect steadiness, and a sloshed pail can mark the stair carpet, and a marked stair carpet is one of the things that are noticed. The housemaid learns to carry with stillness. 7 to 7:30, hot water cans. The copper cans filled from the kitchen boiler. It is essential that the boiler is up to heat by this time, which is why the range must be going by 6, carried up the back staircase, one for each bedroom, set outside each bedroom door at the precise time the family is likely to want them. Too early and the water has cooled by the time it is used. Too late and the family is kept waiting. The timing is a skill, calibrated to the habits of each family member over months and years of observation. 7:30 to 8:30, the breakfast room and the hall. The table laid or confirmed as correctly laid by the parlor maid. The hall swept and dusted and the floor polish applied if it is one of the polishing days. The hat stand checked for tidiness, the umbrella stand arranged, the silver card tray on the console table cleaned and set at the correct angle. The mirror above the console table polished. The mat at the front door shaken, a task that requires going out through the basement area and up the front steps, brief contact with the outside air, the smell of the street, the city already waking, and returning immediately. 8:30 to 10, the bedrooms. This is the extended middle section of the morning's work, performed while the family is at breakfast and the rooms are empty. Each bedroom must be thoroughly done, slops dealt with, washstands cleaned and restocked with fresh water from the jugs brought up from the scullery, beds made, and the Victorian bed making is not the modern flipping of a duvet, it is the precise tucking and smoothing of sheets and blankets and counterpane, with corners that must be hospital sharp and a surface that must be perfectly smooth, made with 2 people working in large households, a single person working alone in smaller ones. Floors swept, grates attended to, furniture dusted, personal items on dressing tables straightened but not moved because moving a family member's personal items is an intrusion. The dusting of the bedrooms requires particular care for a reason that the modern household has largely forgotten: soot. Victorian houses burned coal, and coal smoke, even well-managed coal smoke in a house with good chimneys, produced a fine deposit of particles on every horizontal surface in the house. A surface left undusted for even a day showed it. The dark wooden furniture, the mantelpieces, the picture frames, the books on the shelves, the surfaces of the dressing tables, all of them accumulated a layer of fine grime that was unnoticeable on any given morning and clearly visible if attention lapsed for 2 or 3 days. The dusting was not optional. It was the maintenance of the household's claim to cleanliness against the continuous gentle attrition of the coal-burning city. 10 to 12, the main reception rooms. Drawing room, morning room, dining room, library, each done in the established sequence, which in most households meant working from the top of the room downward, dusting the cornicing and the tops of pictures before the furniture and the floor, so that anything dislodged by the upper dusting could be captured in the sweep of the lower. The ornaments on the drawing room mantelpiece, and the drawing room mantelpiece in a Victorian house was often crowded with ornaments: porcelain figurines, small bronzes, framed photographs, a clock, vases, possibly a glass dome over a piece of taxidermy or an elaborate arrangement of dried flowers. Each ornament must be lifted, the surface beneath it dusted, the ornament replaced in exactly the same position. In a house where the ornaments have been in the same position since before the current housemaid started, the returning of each piece to its place is accomplished by muscle memory, by the body's knowledge of the space. The drawing room carpet was swept, not vacuumed. Mechanical carpet sweepers existed by the 1880s but were still a luxury in many households and required their own maintenance, with a stiff broom using long, even strokes that moved the surface pile without scattering the dust ahead of the broom and depositing it on the furniture already cleaned. The sweeping was followed in most households by a damp tea leaf treatment, used tea leaves scattered across the carpet and then swept up again, the moisture in them carrying the fine dust that the dry broom had lifted without fully capturing. This left the carpet slightly darker for an hour, then returning to its usual color as the leaves dried and were removed. The smell of the drawing room during its cleaning was a mixture of beeswax polish and tea leaves and the dusty warmth of upholstery being disturbed and the particular faint scent of coal ash from the fireplace, a smell that the family, arriving at 10:30 or 11, would find replaced by the scent of the room in its resting state, wood polish and potpourri and the cold ash smell that old fireplaces always carry between burning. 12 to 2, the servants' dinner. The main meal of the servants' day, taken in the middle of the day while the family is at luncheon or engaged in morning calls. The servants' dinner was substantial. This was the meal that provided the physical fuel for the afternoon and evening's work, and was cooked by the cook from the household's provisions, usually with portions that mirrored the family's own meal in terms of nutritional content if not in terms of presentation. The servants ate meat daily in most middle and upper-class Victorian households. This was not universal in working-class life outside service, and the provision of meat daily was mentioned specifically by servants in late oral history interviews as one of the genuine material advantages of service over other occupations. 2 to 4, the afternoon sequence. Different households varied this period considerably, but typically it included the clearing and resetting of any rooms used at luncheon, the preparation of the tea tray for the family's afternoon tea at 4, the turning of mattresses on the days appointed for it, the regular sequence of cleaning tasks assigned to specific days of the week, Monday for bedroom cleaning, Tuesday for the silver, Wednesday for the china, and so on through the week in a rotation that covered every surface and object in the house on a regular cycle. The silver. The weekly silver cleaning was an operation of considerable scale in a large Victorian household where the family owned multiple complete sets of table silver, serving pieces, and ornamental silver displayed in the dining room. The cleaning was done with silver paste, a mild abrasive compound applied with a soft cloth, worked into the engraved surfaces and the hollows of decorative pieces with a small brush, rinsed, and buffed to a mirror finish, and it was done under the butler's supervision, often in the butler's pantry, which had good natural light and a felt-top table on which the silver could be laid without risk of scratching. The butler checked each piece when it was done. A piece with Polish residue in its engraving was done again. 4 to 7, the family's afternoon and early evening. This period involved the tea service, the production, carrying up, and presentation of the afternoon tea tray with its cloth and its small cakes and its correctly arranged teacups and its hot water for refilling the pot, and the management of whatever the family required during these hours, visitors shown in and out, messages taken, the fires stoked, the lamps lit as the afternoon light faded, the room prepared for the evening. The lamps. In the period before gas lighting replaced oil throughout the house, the evening lamp lighting was a small but significant production. Each oil lamp had to be trimmed, the wick cut to the correct length to burn cleanly and brightly without smoking, filled with oil from the household supply, polished, and lit at the moment when the daylight had faded sufficiently to require them but not so early that the family's daytime habits were disrupted by the shift to artificial light. The calculation of this moment was one of the small unspoken skills of the experienced housemaid. Too early and the impression is that the house does not manage its resources well. Too late and the family has been sitting in gathering dimness, which is both uncomfortable and suggestive of inattention. 7 to 11, the dinner service. In households where dinner was a formal occasion, which in middle and upper-class Victorian households it generally was, even when the family was dining alone, the evening's work intensified. Dinner at 8 meant a change table from the afternoon tea arrangement, the cloth replaced, the full silver laid, the crystal glasses set, the centerpiece arranged, the candles placed and lit. The footman or parlour maid waiting at table during dinner was required to be present and attentive for the full length of the meal, which in large households might extend to 10 or 11 courses, taking 2 hours or more. During dinner service, the rule of invisibility operated at its most demanding. The servant at table during dinner was essentially inside a conversation, present for every word, while being professionally required to have heard none of it. The training required to achieve this, to serve a dish, refill a glass, clear a plate, all in smooth silence while maintaining the blank attentive expression that said present but absent, was not instinctive. It was learned, slowly, through the accumulated experience of hundreds of dinners. 11 to midnight, the house secured. After the family had gone upstairs, the reception rooms closed and the fires banked, the kitchen cleaned from the dinner service, the range checked and banked for the night, the back door bolted, the windows in the lower rooms latched. The household security was the butler's final responsibility and the butler's final act of the night was this checking, the circuit of the lower floor, the careful attention to each possible point of entry, the final confirmation that the house was contained. Midnight, the day ends. Ellen, the kitchen maid, has been awake since 5 in the morning. She has carried coal and blacked the range and peeled potatoes and washed dishes and carried more coal and done a dozen other things that no one has specifically noticed because everything has been done correctly, which meant it went without comment, which was the best possible outcome. She goes up the back staircase to the attic room she shares with the other kitchen maid. The room has a sloping ceiling on one side and a window that faces the backs of the houses behind. The bed is narrow. The room is cold. She is asleep before she has thought about it. The house is quiet. The mechanism rests, briefly, before beginning again. Of all the servants in a Victorian household, the cook occupies the most unusual position. Unusual because her authority is not derived from social rank in the household hierarchy in the way the butler's or housekeeper's authority is, but from a kind of technical sovereignty. She is the expert in her domain in a way that no one else in the house, including the housekeeper and the mistress herself, can quite challenge. Her kitchen is her jurisdiction. This was not always acknowledged explicitly, and there were constant minor wars of authority between cooks and housekeepers over exactly where the kitchen's sovereignty began and ended, particularly over the question of provisions, since the housekeeper controlled the store cupboard and the cook required its contents, and the relationship between these two kinds of authority could become, in a poorly managed household, a source of considerable friction. But in practice, what happened in the kitchen was the cook's business, and a cook of real skill knew this and used it. The Victorian kitchen, viewed from the perspective of the food it produced, was operating at a level of complexity that is genuinely impressive. A formal Victorian dinner, the kind that the household's cook was required to produce 2 or 3 times a week for the family's dining, and more frequently when guests were expected, followed a sequence of courses whose structure was as formalized as the service sequence above stairs. The French dining service, known as service à la Russe, had by the 1860s largely replaced the older service à la Française in fashionable households. Where the older style involved placing all the dishes of a course on the table simultaneously, the newer style brought each dish separately, in sequence, which required an entirely different approach to timing in the kitchen. Each course had to be ready at the moment it was needed, not before, because hot food cooling in the kitchen while a previous course was being consumed was an exhibition of bad kitchen management, and the sequencing of 10 or 12 courses over 2 hours meant that the kitchen was never not in motion during a dinner. Something was always on the range or coming off it. Something was always being plated or sauced or garnished. The cook was managing a set of parallel operations that required the same quality of simultaneous attention that an orchestral conductor brings to a performance, the awareness of multiple moving things at once, the constant adjustment of timing and temperature, the eye and the ear trained to catch the moment when something needed intervention. The range was the cook's primary instrument, and the Victorian kitchen range was a more complex tool than the name suggests. It had a firebox that could be regulated by adjusting the airflow through dampers. Opening the damper increased the temperature, closing it reduced it, and a boiler built into the structure that was kept perpetually full and perpetually heated, providing the hot water for the household. It had ovens on both sides of the firebox, which operated at different temperatures because one was closer to the firebox and one farther. It had a hot plate on top, which was the highest temperature cooking surface and which could accommodate multiple pans. It had, in better models, a bain-marie, a shallow tray of hot water into which saucepans could be set to keep sauces and soups warm without continuing to cook, and a warming oven at the bottom, barely above body temperature, where plates were stacked to warm before service. Learning the range, its particular characteristics, its hot spots and cool spots, the way it responded to weather and to the quality of the coal, was a process that took months and was never quite finished, because ranges aged and changed their behavior as their iron warped slightly over years of heating and cooling. An experienced cook could tell the range temperature by holding her hand near the oven door for 3 seconds, a skill so ingrained that she would have been unable to explain how she did it beyond saying that she could tell. The kitchen of a large Victorian household also had its own ecology of smells that the cook lived inside for the entirety of her working day, from the pre-dawn lighting of the range to the post-dinner clearing of the pots. These smells are not separable from the work itself. The smell of pastry butter going into flour, cold butter, cold hands, fast working, because the warmth of the hands begins to melt the butter and warm butter makes a different pastry, was a smell that preceded every pie, every tart, every vol au vent that went upstairs. The smell of a stock simmering on the back of the range, bones and vegetables and the cold water they were started in, slowly intensifying over 4 hours into something dense and savory, was the smell that underlaid everything, the base note of the kitchen's daily production. The smell of jam making in the summer, the sharp sweetness of fruit heated in copper pans with sugar, the moment when the boiling changed character and the surface went from white foam to a deeper, more amber kind of bubble that told the experienced cook the setting point was approaching. The smell of pickling in the autumn, vinegar heated with spices, the astringent sharpness of it filling the kitchen and the scullery and drifting up the basement stairs. The smell of Christmas cake being made in November, brandy and dried fruit and the warm spice of nutmeg and cinnamon, which was one of the most evocative smells in the household calendar and which meant, to anyone who grew up in a house where this happened, something specific about the approach of winter. The cook's relationship to food was not the romantic relationship of the modern television chef. It was a craftsperson's relationship, close, technical, attentive, and unsentimentally practical. Food was a problem to be solved repeatedly, under time pressure, within budget, to a standard that was not negotiable. The standard was set by the family's expectations, and the family's expectations had been formed by every previous cook in every previous household they had inhabited, and they were maintained by the implicit constant comparison between what was produced and what they had had before. A cook who produced food below this standard heard about it, through the housekeeper or through the bell pull, in the indirect but unmistakable language of the Victorian household. The dish was returned, or the mistress had a few words with the housekeeper about the pastry at last Tuesday's dinner, or there was a slight adjustment in the way the family's appreciation was communicated at Christmas, which was when the household paid its annual bonuses and the calibration of those bonuses said everything that the daily routine of complaint and silence had left unsaid. A cook who consistently produced food above this standard had a form of power that no other servant quite possessed, the power of indispensability. A great cook was difficult to replace, because the pool of great cooks was not large, and the competition for them among households of similar standing was real. A housekeeper who created difficulties might be replaced without significant disruption to the household's visible operations. A cook of 20 years standing who gave notice was a domestic crisis, and everyone in the house, including the family, knew it. Some cooks leveraged this awareness consciously. The oral histories contain accounts of cooks who had negotiated half-days not customarily allowed, or higher wages than the position scale would have suggested, or the right to order provisions directly rather than through the housekeeper, small expansions of autonomy that other servants could not have achieved but that a cook the family did not want to lose could sometimes extract through the quiet pressure of her position. This is worth noting because it complicates the picture of the Victorian servant as entirely without agency. Most servants had very little. The cook had some, derived from a specific technical expertise that could not be performed by someone else at short notice. It was a narrow kind of agency and it operated within the household's constraints without fundamentally challenging them. But it was real, and the women who had it knew how to use it, and the households that employed them knew it too. The kitchen maid who worked under the cook occupied a different position entirely. She was the cook's assistant in the kitchen's daily work, preparing vegetables, washing the heavy kitchen equipment, making the basic stocks and sauces that the cook directed, doing the repetitive preparation work that made the cook's more skilled work possible. She was also the person who received the cook's instruction and correction most directly, and the cook's manner toward the kitchen maid varied enormously by household and individual. Some cooks were patient teachers, genuinely interested in passing on their knowledge to a girl who might someday be a cook herself. Some were impatient or demanding or occasionally cruel, in the way that people who have been treated with limited consideration for years sometimes treat those below them with the same quality of limited consideration that they have received. The kitchen was a world of its own, more separate from the family's life than any other part of the house. The cook might go for days without seeing any family member except possibly the mistress, who came to the kitchen on the morning conference, a daily meeting between mistress and cook to review the day's menu requirements and establish the household's needs. The morning conference was the primary formal point of contact between the kitchen and the family, and it was conducted across a particular kind of distance. The mistress in the kitchen on the cook's territory, the cook at her table with her order book, a relationship that was formally hierarchical but that in its daily practice acknowledged the cook's expertise in a way that the family's relationship with most other servants did not. Some mistresses came to this conference with prepared menus. Others came with only a general sense of the number of people to be fed and whether there were any special requirements, leaving the specific decisions to the cook. The latter approach produced better food, in general, because it allowed the cook to plan around what was best in the market that morning, what was in season, what she had in stock. The former approach produced more predictably what the family expected, because it constrained the cook to a predetermined outcome regardless of the raw materials available. These were two different theories of household management, and the tension between them was a constant low note in the relationship between many Victorian mistresses and their cooks. The kitchen maid peeling potatoes beside the range, on her low stool, with the peeling pail between her knees and the potatoes going into the cold water pan on her right, is a figure who appears in the background of a great many Victorian household memoirs and accounts. She is rarely named. She is rarely foregrounded. She is the background condition of the kitchen, doing the work that the cook's more skilled work depends on, learning by proximity what the cook has spent years mastering, absorbing the knowledge of the kitchen the way you absorb any deep skill, not by being formally taught it but by being present for it, daily, for years, until it is simply what you know. When she grew up, if she stayed in service, if she was fortunate and steady and observant, she might someday be the cook herself. She would stand at the range in her own kitchen, in her own household, with her own kitchen maid peeling potatoes on the low stool, and the knowledge she carried would be the knowledge she had started absorbing at 14 in a basement kitchen in Kensington while no one paid her any particular attention. The learning was invisible too. It had to be. In a household organized around invisibility, even the acquisition of skill went unacknowledged. The kitchen smells go on. The stock simmers. The potatoes go into the water. The range breathes its steady heat. Somewhere above, the house arranges itself for another evening, and the kitchen makes it possible. Of all the positions in Victorian domestic service, the lady's maid occupies the most psychologically complex. She is the most intimate servant in the household, closer to the family than the housekeeper in daily physical proximity, closer to the mistress than the mistress's own children in some respects, and yet maintained at a social distance that is, if anything, more carefully enforced because the physical intimacy makes the social distance more necessary. Her work is the care of the mistress's person. Her duties begin before the mistress is fully awake and end after the mistress has retired for the night. She dresses the mistress's hair, an operation that, in the decades when elaborate Victorian coiffure was at its height, could take half an hour or more in the morning, longer for an evening occasion when the hair was dressed formally. She helps the mistress dress and undress, managing the complex fastening systems of Victorian women's clothing, the hooks and eyes and buttons at the back of a dress, the corset laces, the multiple layers of petticoat and foundation garment that constituted a Victorian woman's clothing as an infrastructure. She mends and maintains the mistress's wardrobe, doing the fine needlework repairs, reattaching lace, replacing worn silk linings, replacing buttons, repairing the seams that the corset's tension stressed, that kept expensive garments in service for years longer than they would otherwise have lasted. She attends the mistress on visits and when the household is away from home, traveling with her, managing the luggage, keeping track of the jewelry. She is the person responsible for the jewelry, which is a significant responsibility, since a Victorian lady of any standing might own pieces of considerable monetary and sentimental value, and the jewelry box with its compartments and its lock was in the lady's maid's charge. She is the last person the mistress speaks to at night. When the undressing is done and the hair is brushed, 100 strokes was the conventional prescription, the lady's maid standing behind the seated mistress at the dressing table, the brush moving in long, even strokes through hair that was rarely washed more than once a month in this era, and in some households she is the person to whom the mistress speaks most frankly, because the relationship is both close and bounded in a way that makes a certain kind of frankness possible. The bounds are not ambiguous. The lady's maid is a servant. She does not give opinions unless asked. She does not initiate conversation. She does not offer comfort beyond the practical comfort of well-performed service, clean hair, pressed dress, corrected hem, the correct jewelry produced at the correct moment. But the accumulated hours of physical proximity, of working in silence around another person's body and face and private space, created something that was not friendship and not nothing, a kind of knowing that had no language adequate to it and no acknowledged social form. Some mistresses were aware of this and careful with it. They maintained a deliberate professional distance, were not cold, not unkind, but consistently clear that the relationship was what it was, and this clarity was in some ways easier for both parties than the alternative. Some mistresses, particularly those who were lonely in their marriages, or isolated in large households where social contact was limited, leaned into the ambiguity. They talked to the lady's maid the way they talked to no one else, in the privacy of the dressing room with the door closed, about things they could not say in the drawing room or the bedroom. The lady's maid listened. That was her job. What she did with what she heard was governed by the same professional discretion that governed the footman at dinner. She heard nothing, she remembered nothing, she carried nothing out of the room. In practice, the lady's maid often knew more about the household's private reality than almost anyone else in it. She dressed the bruises when they needed to be dressed. She was present for the arguments that happened in the dressing room in the space between events, after a dinner party that had gone badly, before a family occasion that everyone was dreading. She heard the crying. She knew which correspondence was being kept from whom. She knew the state of the marriage and the state of the family's finances and the state of the mistress's health in ways that the mistress might not have disclosed to anyone, including her husband. This knowledge was power, of a kind, and a kind of burden. The lady's maid who had served a family for many years was the repository of its intimacies, the keeper of its private face, and the professional code required her to carry this as though it had no weight. The Victorian household system had produced a category of person whose entire value depended on their absolute trustworthiness in relation to information that, if misused, could have been catastrophic, and it maintained this value through the threat of immediate dismissal and social ruin, because a lady's maid known to have broken discretion was unemployable in any respectable household afterward. The position of lady's maid was socially awkward in another direction as well. She was not quite of the same world as the other servants, she was better educated in most cases, better dressed, her work involving fine skills and a certain amount of aesthetic judgment, and she occupied a position of particular trust that gave her an unusual degree of access to the family. Some housekeepers resented this. Some butlers found it difficult to manage in the servants' hall hierarchy, where the lady's maid's position technically sat above the housemaid's but below the cook, a ranking that satisfied no one completely because the lady's maid's relationship to authority in the household was structured differently from everyone else's. She was also, uniquely, bilingual. She moved between the servant's world and the family's world in a way that no other servant quite did, entering the mistress's bedroom in the morning with an intimate naturalness that the housemaid, cleaning the room, did not have, sitting in the servant's hall at meals with the competence of someone who had grown up in service. She knew both worlds from the inside. And she could speak neither of them to the other. The lady's maid of a Victorian household was most often a woman who had grown up in service and worked her way up through the ranks, started as a parlour maid or a housemaid, developed skill with needlework and personal care, attracted the attention of a housekeeper who saw the potential for advancement. Some were women of slightly higher social origin than the typical servant, the daughter of a reduced family, or a woman who had fallen on difficult times and entered service rather than face a worse alternative. In these cases, the social ambiguity of the position was sharper, because she knew from her own experience what the family's world looked and felt like from the other side of the social boundary. These women, the ladies' maids of slightly genteel background, caught between two worlds and fully belonging to neither, appear in Victorian fiction with some frequency, because their position generates the particular kind of dramatic tension that the rigid social architecture of the period produced. The person who knows too much, who occupies a position that the system cannot quite account for, whose loyalty is to a household that simultaneously needs her and cannot quite bring itself to acknowledge her as fully human. Mrs. Henry Wood's novel East Lynne, published in 1861, contains a lady's maid whose role in the narrative is precisely this. She is the keeper of the family's secrets, present at every domestic crisis, moving silently through the household while the plot turns around her. She is not the protagonist. That would have required the novel to acknowledge something about her interior life that Victorian fiction of this period could not quite do, but she is structurally indispensable in a way that mirrors the real indispensability of the position. The reality was quieter and more ordinary than fiction made it. Most ladies' maids spent most of their working days in the sewing room or the dressing room, doing fine mending by the light of the dressing table mirror, waiting for the bell that would announce the mistress's readiness to dress for the evening. The waiting was its own form of work, not passive, because the hands were always occupied, but a particular quality of suspended attentiveness, of being ready without being urgently required, that was in its own way taxing. The sewing room in a large Victorian household was a small room, usually on the first floor or the bedroom floor, adjacent to the mistress's dressing room. It had good natural light, essential for fine needlework, a sewing table, a dressmaking form, a chair for the lady's maid and possibly a second chair if she was expected to receive the junior household staff for instruction in mending. It smelled of fabric and thread and the beeswax that needles were drawn through to reduce friction. It was quiet, usually, with the particular quiet of a room that is not in the household's main circulation. In this quiet room, with her hands occupied and her attention not fully required, the lady's maid's thoughts were her own. This was not common in her working day. Most of her hours were spent either in the direct performance of her duties or in the close social environment of the servants' hall, where privacy of thought was not much easier to achieve than privacy of space. The sewing room, when she was alone in it, was a place where she could think without audience. What she thought is not recorded. It was not the kind of thing that was recorded, partly because she was unlikely to write it down and partly because the system had no mechanism for receiving the interior life of a servant as anything worth preserving. What we have instead is the texture of her days, the hair brushed 100 times, the lace reattached with fine thread and a needle so small it was barely visible between the fingers, the dress pressed with the iron heated on the range, the jewelry counted and replaced in its compartments and locked away, and the knowledge that inside this texture, a person was thinking. The dressing table holds its mirror. The room is quiet. Outside the window, the street goes about its evening business. The lamp on the sewing table makes a small circle of warm light. She threads the needle. She begins. The lady's maid's relationship with clothing was one of deep and practical intimacy. Victorian women's clothes were not simple objects. They were, in the case of a well-dressed woman of any social standing, complex constructions of silk and wool and cotton and linen, lined and stiffened and structured, trimmed with lace and ribbon and jet beads and all the elaborate decorative vocabulary of the period. They were expensive. They were expected to last, with proper maintenance, for years. And they required constant attention to survive that duration. The weekly routine of the lady's maid involved a careful examination of every garment in the mistress's wardrobe, checking seams for signs of stress, examining the places where fabric was most subject to wear, the underarms of bodices, the backs of skirts at the waist where the corset's edge put pressure, the hem where the dress touched the floor, and making the small repairs that prevented small damage from becoming large damage. A seam restitch now saved the cost and effort of remaking a bodice in 6 months. A loose hook resecured today prevented a wardrobe crisis at a dinner party next week. The repairs themselves were performed with very fine needles and thread matched so carefully to the fabric's color and texture that a good repair was effectively invisible. This was another form of the household's preferred relationship with its own maintenance, the repair done so well that it could not be detected. The pristine appearance of the mistress's wardrobe was, like the pristine appearance of the room she inhabited, the product of continuous attentive work rendered perfectly invisible. The hairdressing was perhaps the most intimate of the lady's maid's daily duties, and the one that most clearly illustrates the paradox of her position. To dress another person's hair requires physical proximity of a kind that Victorian social life almost entirely avoided between people of different social classes. The lady's maid's hands moved through the mistress's hair, handling it, arranging it, securing it, with a familiarity that would have been startling in any other context. The act was depersonalized by professional framing. It was a service, a skilled technical procedure, and the technical framing allowed both parties to maintain the pretense that the physical intimacy was not intimacy at all but simply the necessary condition of the work. Victorian hairdressing for women of fashion was a genuinely skilled practice. The styles of the 1860s and 1870s involved elaborate arrangements of the hair over pads and frames and wire forms that shaped the mass of hair into the specific silhouette of the period, the low chignon at the back, the waved or curled arrangement at the front, the carefully disciplined structure that made a fashionable Victorian coiffure something quite different from simply arranged hair. Achieving this required knowledge of the individual woman's hair, its thickness, its texture, how it responded to damp and to heat, which arrangements held and which collapsed by afternoon, knowledge that was accumulated over months and years of daily practice. The curling tongs, heated in a small spirit lamp or over a candle flame, required careful temperature control. Too hot and they scorched the hair, leaving a smell and a brittleness that no subsequent arrangement could disguise. Too cool and they produced only a temporary wave that relaxed within the hour. The experienced lady's maid tested the temperature of the tongs by holding them close to her cheek, close enough to feel the heat but not close enough to burn, a calibration made by touch and the body's own response, not by any external measure. This knowledge, like the cook's knowledge of the range, was embodied in the practitioner's hands and senses. It could not be fully articulated or written down in a way that transferred the actual skill. You learned it by doing it, hundreds of times, slowly developing the judgment that distinguished a good result from a poor one, until the judgment was no longer a conscious assessment but a simple recognition. This is right, this is not, made immediately and without deliberation. The dressing table at which this work was performed was the mistress's most personal space in the bedroom, the surface covered with her particular collection of brushes and bottles and small ornaments, the mirror above it angled to her height, the light falling from the window in the specific way she preferred. The lady's maid moved through this space with the ease of long familiarity, knowing where everything was kept, knowing the particular preferences and small rituals of the morning routine, which perfume was in use this week, which hair ornament was wanted for this particular occasion, the order in which the mistress preferred to take her morning preparations. Some mistresses, particularly those with nervous or exacting temperaments, developed very precise requirements about their morning routine, and any deviation from the established sequence could produce an irritation disproportionate to the actual significance of what had varied. The lady's maid who served such a mistress learned the routine with something approaching the precision of a ritual, fixed, in the same order, producing the same results, deviation not an option. This was neither cruel nor unusual by the standards of the period. It was simply the mistress's particular version of the household's general preference for regularity and order, applied to the most personal level of domestic life. Other mistresses were easier, less rigid in their requirements, more responsive to the lady's maid's judgment about what would look best or what the day's events required. In these households the morning dressing was a more conversational process, the lady's maid offering suggestions and the mistress accepting or modifying them, the relationship having room for something approaching professional dialogue. These were the households where the role felt least like pure service and most like the skilled specialist consultation that, in a more equitable world, it might have been openly acknowledged as. The lady's maid who served a mistress for 20 years accumulated a knowledge of that woman's physical self, her preferences, her vanities, the physical changes of age, the particular way anxiety showed in the set of her shoulders on difficult mornings, that no other person in the household came close to matching. Not the housekeeper, whose knowledge was domestic and administrative. Not the cook, whose knowledge was culinary and practical. Not the family, who saw the mistress only in her social presentation, never in the undefended state of the early morning before the day's persona was assembled. The lady's maid saw the person before the persona. This was perhaps the most intimate thing about the position, and the most demanding, to see clearly and to say nothing, to know thoroughly and to carry the knowledge as though it weighed nothing, to be trusted completely and to make that trust absolute through the professional discipline of total discretion. The sewing room lamp burns low. The evening is deep. The needle moves through the fabric in small, exact stitches that will not be seen but that will hold. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. A housemaid named Jane Alden went into service in 1878 at the age of 14. She started as a scullery maid in a household in Bradford, Yorkshire, working for a textile manufacturer of modest wealth who had recently moved his family into a new-built terrace house and was still assembling the staff to run it. She earned £7 a year, paid quarterly, and sent £2 of each quarter's wage home to her mother, who had 4 younger children and a husband whose health was uncertain. These facts we know because Jane Alden was interviewed in 1956, when she was 92 years old, by a social historian researching the history of domestic service in the north of England. The interview transcript, 68 pages of typescript, is held in the archive of a local history society in Bradford. It is one of perhaps 300 such oral history transcripts produced in Britain in the years after the Second World War, when the generation of women who had been in Victorian service was entering old age and a small number of researchers and local historians recognized that within a decade their testimony would be unrecoverable. Jane Alden's testimony is valuable not because it is exceptional but because it is specific, and specificity is what the historical record of domestic service mostly lacks. We have manuals and guides and instructions in quantity. We have the family's perspective, articulated in diaries and letters and memoirs. We have the census records that document that 1.3 million domestic servants existed. What we rarely have is the servant's own account of what it felt like to be there, inside those houses, inside those routines, inside the daily experience of necessary invisibility. What Jane Austen describes, in her 92-year-old voice working carefully over 80-year-old memories, is not what the manuals prescribed. Or rather, it is what the manuals prescribed, but seen from the inside, seen as something that was not a system or a structure but a texture. The smell of the scullery in winter, the stone floor cold through the soles of her boots, the particular sound the mangle made when the tablecloths were put through it, a rhythmic grinding that she could hear in her sleep for years afterward. The cook who taught her how to tell when a custard was set without a thermometer, a particular way it moved when you tilted the dish slightly, a relationship between the custard surface and the dish angle that she learned by failing at it several times before one morning it simply clicked into knowledge she had not had the morning before. She did not describe her early life in service as miserable. This is one of the things that is hard to receive properly when you encounter it in the oral histories, the consistent absence of the misery narrative that modern sympathies expect. Her early years were hard. The cold, the hours, the exhaustion, the homesickness, she mentions homesickness particularly, the way it was sharp in the first month and then became a dull background presence for years, never quite going away, modulating gradually from acute longing into something more like a permanent mild awareness of distance from home. But she does not call the overall experience miserable, because that is not the word that fits. The word that fits is her own, she calls it her life. Her life changed when she moved, at 17, to a household in Leeds where the mistress was a woman whose own background had been unconventional, the daughter of a Quaker family with educational views that were unusual for the period, who ran her household according to a slightly different set of assumptions about the people who worked in it. This mistress called her servants by their first names, not the household assigned name but their actual given name, which in the case of servants with common names like Jane was sometimes the same thing but which in other cases differed significantly from the label the household would otherwise have imposed. She asked after their families. She arranged for the household to have a lending library subscription, which meant that the servants could borrow books if they chose, a provision that Jane Austen mentions with a particular kind of gratitude that comes through clearly even in transcript, because she had not known before this household that she was the kind of person for whom books were available. She became a reader in that household. She read on Sunday afternoons, on her half-day, sitting in the servants' hall when it was empty, or in the summer in the back garden when the weather permitted. She read Dickens. She read Wilkie Collins. She read what was available in the lending library, which was a slightly random selection. The library's subscription allowed access to circulating popular fiction of the period, with a bias toward the respectable and the improving, and she read without the discrimination of someone who has been educated to read for quality, which meant she read everything with the same total absorption that books allow when you are new to them and have not yet learned to be partially present while reading. Her reading was secret in the way that most internal life in the Victorian household was secret, not hidden, exactly, not prohibited, but not acknowledged as something that was happening. The lending library subscription was the mistress's provision, and the servants using it was presumably part of the point. But the reading itself, the interior experience of it, was nobody's business but Jane Austen's. It was hers in the same way that the morning before the house woke was hers, a space within the household structure that the structure could not quite reach. This is one of the things I find most movingly present in the oral history transcripts of domestic servants. The evidence of interior lives that the household systems were designed to not know about and that existed anyway, quietly and persistently, in the gaps that even the most comprehensive system of invisibility could not entirely close. The housemaid who had a sweetheart against regulations and managed to conduct a correspondence with him by the simple expedient of posting and collecting letters from a friend in the street. The footman who was writing a novel in the evenings of his half-days, an activity he did not tell anyone about for 5 years, partly because he could not be certain how it would be received and partly because the privacy of it was part of what made it possible. The scullery maid who had taught herself to read using the newspaper that came down from the morning room once the family had finished with it, moving through the words with the slow attention of someone who has had no teacher but the letters themselves. These people were not unusual for the period. They were not exceptional individuals who managed to maintain interiority against unusual odds. They were ordinary people doing what ordinary people do, which is to maintain the experience of being human within whatever constraints the circumstances impose. The constraints were real and they were significant. The invisibility was real and its effects were real. But invisibility is a thing that can be imposed on the surface of a life without reaching its depth, and the depth of these lives, what Jane Austen felt about the lending library and the mistress who arranged for it, what the novel-writing footman was building in his half-day evenings, what the letter-writing housemaid felt when she received an answer, was not the household's business and not the household's to control. Service was also, for many Victorian women, a site of practical formation, of learning skills and accumulating knowledge and developing capacities that would eventually take them somewhere else. The cook who after 20 years opened a small boarding house with her savings and managed it with the same professional competence she had brought to the kitchen. The housekeeper who kept her accounts so carefully that she had put aside enough to buy a small property in her home village and retire to it at 60. The housemaid who married a tradesman at 30 and managed his household accounts with an efficiency that surprised him until he understood that she had been managing a large household's operations since she was 14. These are not stories of transcendence. They are not stories of people escaping their circumstances through exceptional talent or exceptional luck, though exceptional talent and exceptional luck certainly existed. They are stories of accumulation, of skills and knowledge and small savings and the particular kind of practical intelligence that develops in people who have been responsible, from a young age, for the operation of complex systems, and who have learned to manage those systems in the particular way that the Victorian household required, attentively, continuously, and without acknowledgement. The not acknowledgement left its mark. This too is present in the oral histories, in the places where the testimony becomes quieter or more elliptical, in the words that are reached for and not quite found. The sense that the years of one's best physical capacity were given over entirely to the maintenance of someone else's comfort, that the work was real and significant and unrecognized, not because it was done badly but because the system was designed to not see it. This is the residue that some of the oldest voices in these transcripts carry. Not bitterness, which implies an expectation of something different. More like a quiet notation of facts. This is what it was. These were my years. This is what I did with them. Jane Austen, at 92, does not linger on this. She moves through it the way she moved through the household, efficiently, without self-pity, getting to the next thing. But the historian's transcript catches a moment near the end of the interview when she pauses for a long time. The transcript records it as a silence, and then says something that the historian has put in quotation marks because it is clearly verbatim. She says, "We kept those houses. And they never quite knew it was us." This sentence has stayed with me since I first read it. Not because it is a complaint, which it is not, the tone of the transcript is clear on this, she says it with a kind of retrospective clarity rather than grievance. But because of how precisely it names the structure. The keeping was real, the not knowing was also real, and the two of them existed simultaneously in a system that required both. The houses were kept. The fires were lit. The meals were produced. The linen was pressed. The silver was polished. The table was laid. The hot water arrived at the washstand. The family moved through their lives in the condition of smoothly maintained comfort that they had paid for and that they experienced, in the way the system was designed to produce, as simply the natural order of a well-run home. It was not the natural order. It was Ellen, 14 years old, carrying coal before the city woke. It was Jane Austen reading Dickens in the servants' hall on Sunday afternoon. It was the kitchen maid's hands calloused from the range and the cook's knowledge of temperature and the ladies' maid's counted brushstrokes and the footman's careful neutrality at the dinner table. It was people. People who kept themselves visible, inside, where the household could not reach them. The savings. One of the most striking features of the oral history testimonies of domestic servants is how many of them mention savings. The small, regular setting aside of money from wages that was the primary form of financial security available in a life that offered very few others. The servant who saved carefully over a working life of 20 or 30 years could accumulate a sum that, while not large by the standards of the middle class, was genuinely significant by the standards of the working class from which most servants came. The housekeeper Mrs. Ramsay at a Berkshire house, interviewed by a local historian in the 1960s when she was 87, described her savings with the same methodical precision she had brought to the household accounts. She had saved from her first year in service. She had saved through 43 years of service, never taking a year off, sending a portion home to her parents in the early years and keeping more for herself as she advanced in the hierarchy and her wages increased. At retirement she had in the post office savings account. The post office savings bank, established in 1861, was the primary savings institution for the working class in this period, a sum sufficient to rent a small house in the village where she had grown up and to live in it without working for the remainder of her life, which proved to be another 17 years. 17 years. She had 17 years of the unencumbered life, the life lived without the household's claim on its every hour, that she had not had since she was 13. She spent some of it in the garden, growing vegetables with the same methodical attention she had brought to the linen inventory. She spent some of it in the village, becoming by degrees a person of standing in a community that had known her since childhood. She spent some of it reading, the lending library having been, she said, the great pleasure of her retirement. 17 years is not a great freedom, measured against 43 years of service. But it was hers, and she knew it was hers, and she had prepared for it with the same careful foresight she had brought to everything else in her professional life. Jane Alden married at 33, a grocer's assistant she had met at church on her Sunday afternoons over 2 years of cautious acquaintance. She left service. She managed her husband's household accounts with a precision that, she noted in the oral history interview, was entirely natural to her after years of service. She had 3 children. She was happy, she said, in a way that she had not specifically thought about being or not being during her years of service, because happiness was not a category that the service life gave much space to. The difference between the service life and the life afterward, she said, was the difference between being required and being chosen. In service she had been required, her presence a function of the household's need. In her own home she was chosen, her presence the result of people who wanted her there rather than needed a person in that position. This distinction, which she articulated very clearly at 92, was something she had not had language for during the service years but that she had felt. The oral history interview ended shortly after this. She died the following spring, at 93, in Leeds. Her story is in the archive. It will be there for as long as archives are kept. Everything we have been talking about so far has been the urban household, the Kensington townhouse, the Leeds terrace, the Edinburgh apartment with its servants in the basement and its family on the upper floors. This was the dominant form of Victorian domestic service in terms of sheer numbers, because the cities held the numbers. But the most visible, the most elaborate, the most architecturally committed expression of the Victorian servant system was not the city house. It was the country house, and the country house represents a different scale of the same phenomenon entirely. A large Victorian country house, one of the great houses of England, a Chatsworth or a Longleat or a Petworth, but also the hundreds of less famous but still substantial houses of the rural aristocracy and upper gentry, might employ 30, 40, or in the grandest cases 60 or more servants. Not a household but a small institution, with its own hierarchies and departments and budgets and internal politics, its own geography of service routes and spaces, its own economy of permission and authority operating in parallel with the family's occupation of the house. The layout of a Victorian country house was, if anything, even more deliberately divided between the family's world and the servant's world than the urban townhouse. The architects who designed these houses, Robert Kerr's influential 1864 architectural treatise The Gentleman's House, is the most thorough guide to the principles involved, approached the servant question as a primary design problem. The house had to accommodate 2 completely different modes of life, and the design had to ensure they did not accidentally intersect. Kerr's principles were clear: the family's wing and the servant's wing should be separated by a transition zone, a passage or a set of rooms that served as a buffer, so that noise and smell from the kitchen quarters did not penetrate the family's rooms. The servant's route from the kitchen to the dining room should be as direct as possible while remaining invisible from the family's perspective. This usually meant a dedicated service passage, sometimes running behind the dining room's wall, through which dishes could be carried from the kitchen to the serving room adjacent to the dining room, a room where food was plated and finished before the footman carried it into the dining room proper. The serving room, sometimes called the servery, was one of the most important and least known spaces in the Victorian country house. It sat between the kitchen's world and the dining room's world, belonging to neither, serving as the physical and functional transition between the rough heat of the kitchen and the polished formality of the dining table. Here the food arrived from the kitchen hot and somewhat rough, here it was transferred to the family's silver, garnished, arranged on the correct serving pieces, tasted if necessary for seasoning, and made ready to appear. The serving room was where invisible work became visible food. The country house servants' hall was a room of genuine scale, long tables, a fireplace, windows, often a high ceiling, a space designed to accommodate the full complement of servants for meals. In a house with 40 servants, this was a room that functioned more like a staff canteen than anything domestic. The seating hierarchy operated here as it did everywhere, but in a house this size the gradations were more elaborate. The upper servants had their table or their separate room, the household servants had theirs, the outdoor servants, the grooms and gardeners and gamekeepers who might come to the hall for their meals, had their designated places at the lower end of the table. The outdoor servants are a population that the urban household did not have and that the country house required in considerable numbers. The stable was the most significant. A large country house might have a dozen horses or more, requiring grooms and stable boys and the head groom, a position of considerable responsibility and status, who managed the stable's operations with the same professional authority that the butler brought to the house's interior. The garden required gardeners, head gardener with his own cottage, under-gardeners, garden boys, all operating under a system of hierarchy and specialization that mirrored the household's internal structure. The gamekeeper occupied a peculiar position in the country house's social ecology, necessary, skilled, operating in the outdoor world with a degree of autonomy that indoor servants did not have, but also present at the house for certain domestic interactions and present in the servants' hall for certain meals. His relationship to the butler and the housekeeper was different from the relationship between indoor servants, because his authority and his operations were largely outside the household system. He served the family but through a different kind of service, maintaining the game stocks, managing the shoots, operating in a rural outdoor world whose rhythms were seasonal rather than daily. The laundry, in a large country house, was its own department. The washing of the household's linen, and a country house's linen was an extraordinary quantity of material, the bed linens of 30 or 40 beds, the table linens for daily use and formal entertainment, the household cloths and the servants' uniforms and the family's personal laundry, was performed by a laundry maid or a team of laundry maids working in a dedicated laundry building that was positioned downwind of the house and at a distance from the main building. The smell of boiling linen, the steam of the copper wash boilers, the chalk-white ground of the bleaching green where the wet laundry was spread to dry in the summer sun, these were the sensory signatures of the Victorian laundry day, which happened on Monday and occupied the laundry maids for much of the week. The pressing and folding that followed the washing was an operation of considerable skill. Starched table linen had to be ironed to a perfectly smooth, slightly crisp finish. The iron moved in long strokes, the heat regulated by testing on a cloth, the attention to the ironing of fine embroidered edges and monogrammed corners requiring the same small-scale precision as the lady's maid's needlework. The sheets were folded in precise quarters, their creased edges aligned, then stored in the linen cupboard in ordered stacks, the oldest on top so that the rotation was managed and the linen wore evenly. The linen cupboard was the housekeeper's domain as much as any room in the house. She counted the linen at intervals, its condition noted, its mending requirements assigned to the laundry maid or the lady's maid depending on the fineness of the repair, and she maintained an inventory that tracked the household stock against its needs. Linens wore out and were replaced on a cycle that the housekeeper managed over years, planning the replacements so that the household's working stock was always adequate without the expense of replacing everything at once. This was small-scale estate management of the kind that made the Victorian housekeeper, in a large house, something genuinely close to a domestic administrator. The still room was another space specific to the country house, a room between the kitchen and the family's dining world where certain specialist productions were made, the jams and preserves and pickles and cordials and homemade medicines that the household self-sufficiency required, the special baked goods that the cook might not produce in the kitchen proper, the flower arrangements for the house that were the still room maid's responsibility in most establishments. The still room maid occupied an unusual position. She reported to the housekeeper rather than the cook. Her work was more varied and less physically demanding than the kitchen's work, and the still room itself, with its pleasant smells of fruit and sugar and dried flowers, was one of the more agreeable workrooms in the house. A country house in August, during the shooting season, when the house was full of the family's guests and the number of people to be fed had doubled and the household was operating at its maximum intensity, dinners of 12 to 20, shooting lunches in the field, breakfasts for early departing sportsmen, teas for the ladies who had not gone out, was a household operating under significant strain. Extra staff were sometimes hired for the season, extra kitchen maids, an additional footman, temporary laundry help. The permanent staff worked extended hours even by their usual standards. This is the Victorian country house at its most demanding, and it produced, among the servants who lived through it, the kind of professional pride that comes from managing very difficult things very well. The cook who produced a flawless dinner for 20 in a kitchen heated to 90 degrees by August weather and the range going full speed. The butler who managed the wine service for a table of 12 with 2 footmen he had known for a week. The housemaid who kept 30 guest bedrooms in perfect order while the family's guests left them in the careless disorder that guests in other people's houses always do. The house absorbed all of this. From the family's perspective, from the guest's perspective, the house absorbed it invisibly. The food appeared. The rooms were ready. The fires burned. The breakfast was laid. The invisible mechanism performed at a higher intensity than usual and the family noticed, when they noticed anything, that the house was running particularly smoothly. I find this extraordinary, still, even after spending a great deal of time inside the history of it. Not that the work was hard. Hard work was not unusual in the Victorian period, inside or outside service. Not that the invisibility was maintained under pressure, the servants had been trained to maintain it precisely for occasions like this. What I find extraordinary is the scale of the commitment required. The commitment to a system that demanded this level of effort and then arranged itself specifically not to see that the effort had happened. The country house in the autumn, after the guests have gone and the shooting season has ended and the house has returned to the family alone, settles back into its regular pace. The extra staff depart. The house sighs, if houses can sigh, and becomes its ordinary self again. The servants' hall in the evening. The fire lower now than in the busy season. The upper servants in the housekeeper's room. The lower servants at the long table, talking among themselves in the quiet that follows a sustained period of intensity, the particular kind of conversation that happens between people who have been through something together and are now on the other side of it, without quite needing to say what it was. The house is quiet. The family is in the drawing room. The evening is settling in. Outside, the October night is cold and clear and the stars over the home fields are as thick as they have always been, unhurried, unconcerned with anything happening below them. But let us stay in the country house a little longer, because there is something in the scale of it that I want to sit with, something that the urban household's more modest dimensions do not quite capture. In a house with 40 servants, you are not merely a member of a household. You are a member of a community. A small, involuntary, internally stratified community, governed by rules you did not write and hierarchies you did not choose, but a community nonetheless. With its own rhythms and its own stories and its own history that predated your arrival and would continue after your departure. The long-serving servants in a great country house, the butler who had been with the family for 20 years, the cook who had come as kitchen maid and risen over 15 years to her present position, the head groom who had known the estate since he was a boy, these were people whose relationship to the house was as deep in its way as the family's. They had watched the children of the house grow up. They had been present at events the family would have preferred to have kept private. They knew where things were kept and why certain rooms were not used and which topics were avoided at the dinner table and which pieces of silver had been in the family for generations and which were relatively recent acquisitions. This kind of knowledge was a form of intimacy that the household's formal structure officially denied. The servant did not know the family in the sense the household acknowledged. The servant was not acknowledged as knowing the family. But the knowing was real. It accumulated over years of daily proximity. It lived in the servants who held it, passed sometimes from an older servant to a newer one, a quiet orientation to the household's particular character, the unspoken transmission of institutional memory that kept the house's internal culture continuous across the generations of servants who worked in it. The annual cycle of a country house had its own deep rhythms that the servants knew in their bodies. The spring cleaning, the great annual turning out that happened when the family went to London for the season, leaving the country house empty and available for the systematic cleaning that could not be done while it was occupied. Carpets rolled up and beaten. Curtains taken down and sent to the laundry. Fireplaces cleaned back to bare brick. Furniture moved and the dust behind it addressed that had accumulated since the previous spring. Walls washed down in the servants' quarters. The house made bare and then made again, better, before the family returned in August for the shooting. This spring cleaning was work of a different character from the daily maintenance, more physically demanding, more disruptive, involving the whole household in a shared project that temporarily reorganized the hierarchy around the task rather than the usual position. The butler would be directing the moving of furniture. The housekeeper would be overseeing the linen room's annual inventory and replacement. The cook would be managing the kitchen's own deep clean with the kitchen maid. And the housemaids, released from their usual room-by-room maintenance routine, would be doing the big work, the carpet beating, the curtain washing, the window cleaning inside and out. There is a particular quality of exhaustion that follows the spring cleaning, a good exhaustion, the kind that comes from having done something complete, from having brought an accumulation to its resolution. The house after the spring cleaning had a different quality to it, not just cleaner but somehow more itself, as if the process of cleaning had also renewed some quality of the space that the daily maintenance preserved but could not restore once it had diminished. The servants who had worked in a house through multiple spring cleanings had a relationship to its spaces that was simultaneously physical and temporal. They knew the house as a place that was different at different moments of its annual cycle. The house in August, full of guests and operating at maximum intensity, was a different experience from the house in November, quiet and self-contained, from the house in March when it was empty and open to being cleaned. These were not different houses. They were the same house at different moments of its year, and to know all of them was to know the house in a way that the family, who moved through London and country with their own preoccupations, rarely did. The village around the country house was also part of the servants' world in a way it was not part of the family's, or not in the same way. The indoor servants shopped in the village market on their days off. They attended the village church on Sundays, sitting in the pew that had been assigned to the household servants for generations, separated from the family's pew by the distance the architecture of Victorian Anglican worship ordained. They knew the village shopkeepers and the schoolmistress and the curate and the other village inhabitants with the easy familiarity of people who lived in close proximity for years. The footman who was walking out with the dressmaker's daughter from the village. The kitchen maid whose aunt lived in the estate cottages and whom she visited on Sunday afternoons. The housekeeper who had grown up in the village before going to service and who returned to it at the end of her working life as a woman of modest but established respectability. The country house servant was not merely a creature of the house, she was also a creature of the landscape and the community around it, connected to it in ways that the family's more mobile and socially elaborate world did not encourage. This rootedness in place had its own particular quality. The servant who had been at a country house for 20 years knew the estate's fields and woods as well as any of the outdoor staff. She knew which path through the home would came out by the lake and which turned back toward the kitchen garden. She knew the smell of the garden after rain and the sound of the rooks in the elms by the church in the spring evenings and the quality of the light over the home fields in August when the shooting season was beginning. This was her landscape as much as the family's, perhaps more, in a practical daily sense, since she walked in it more often and in more weathers and knew it not as a prospect from the drawing-room window but as the ground underfoot on an October morning when the leaves were down. The country house and the landscape it sat in, and the village that surrounded it, and the community of servants and outdoor staff and village inhabitants that lived and worked within its orbit, all of this was a world entire. A world that the Victorian era produced at its characteristic scale and that the 20th century reduced, through taxation and social change and the simple economics of maintaining a large household in a changing labor market, to something smaller, more modest, and in many cases entirely gone. The houses remain, many of them. Chatsworth, Longleat, Petworth, Erdig, in Wales, now a National Trust property where the servant portraits that the last owners had commissioned still hang in the basement passages, the faces of the coachmen and the housemaids and the laundry maids looking out from their frames at the visitors who come to see the house. The owners of Erdig were unusual in having thought to document the people who kept the place. Most houses did not. But the houses remain, and in the houses the marks remain, the groove in the stone threshold where the coal scuttle was set down 1,000 times, the worn tread of the back staircase, the hook in the servants' passage where the key ring was hung each night. The physical residue of a way of life that ended between 1914 and 1939, as the servants left for the factories and the war work and the new possibilities that the 20th century opened to working-class women, and the houses gradually contracted around the families who could no longer afford to maintain them at the old scale. Victorian domestic service was not a sealed world. Things happened in it that the system was not designed to accommodate, that the manuals did not address, that the household's formal structure did not know how to contain. The daily reality of life in service included kindnesses and cruelties and boredoms and small joys and deep attachments and bitter endings and things that cannot be placed in any category, that simply were what they were in the way that life is always more than its arrangements. The question of personal relationships between servants and family members, and between servants themselves, was one that the Victorian household system handled poorly, not through cruelty in most cases but through a kind of deliberate insufficiency. The system's model of the servant was a professional whose personal life was subordinated to the household's requirements, and this model was applied to situations that professional frameworks were not equipped to handle. The servant who became ill. The formal provision for illness in Victorian domestic service was minimal. A servant who was too ill to work received their board and lodging while they recovered, if the household was generous, and was given their notice if the illness was extended. There was no sick pay in the modern sense. There was no provision for the costs of illness. A servant who became seriously ill was, within the household's formal framework, a service disruption, a position that needed to be filled, temporarily or permanently, depending on the prognosis. The reality was often more complicated than this, because householders and their servants had been living together for years in some cases, and the fact of cohabitation created bonds that the formal framework did not recognize but that were real in the way that all bonds forged in daily proximity are real. A mistress who had watched a housemaid grow from a 13-year-old who was afraid of the range into a competent and steady woman of 30 was not entirely indifferent to that woman's well-being, and the accounts of illness in domestic service, the diaries, the letters, the memoirs, contain many instances of families caring for sick servants beyond what was contractual required, calling in the doctor at the family's expense, sitting with a seriously ill servant themselves, making provisions for a servant's family when the servant could no longer support them. This did not eliminate the structural vulnerability. A servant who was old or consistently unwell would eventually be managed out of the household, the formal termination of notice given, a reference provided, the position filled, and the provision for what happened to them after the household support ended was as inadequate as it was for any member of the Victorian working class in similar circumstances. The workhouse, the family if they had one, or nothing. The Victorian state had not yet developed the infrastructure of social support that would eventually be built, in the following century, on the ruins of exactly this kind of inadequacy. But within the household, within the daily reality of a shared domestic world, the formal coldness of the system was often modified by the informalities of actual human relationship, and some of those modifications were significant. The elderly cook who had served a family for 30 years and was quietly kept on in a nominal capacity after she could no longer do the full work, her wages continued, her place at the table maintained, the fiction of useful employment sustained by mutual agreement. The housemaid whose mother was dying and who was given the unheard-of provision of a full week away rather than the usual day, the family managing without her, and not speaking of the management or the inconvenience. These were not systematic. They were not rights. They were gifts, given or withheld at the family's pleasure, dependent on the quality of the relationship and the generosity of the individual family and the servant's own particular standing in the household's affections. The servant who had made herself agreeable and competent over years might receive them. The servant who had not might not. This precariousness was intrinsic to the structure, and it was one of the things that made the servant's situation different from the employee's situation in a form of employment with legal protections, even when the practical daily experience of the two was similar. The question of leaving. The movement of servants between positions was one of the most significant features of the Victorian domestic service world, and it was in some respects more dynamic than the picture of the long-serving retainer would suggest. The ideals of Victorian household management, the 30-year cook, the 40-year housekeeper, existed and were celebrated precisely because they were not typical. The typical servant moved positions every few years, sometimes more often, in search of better wages or a more congenial household or a position with different responsibilities, or simply the change that comes from living too long in one place. This movement required a reference. The character reference in Victorian domestic service was the passport of the servant world, a letter from the previous employer that confirmed the servant's honesty and capability and the reason for their departure. Without a good reference, a servant could not obtain a new position in a respectable household. With a bad one, or with no reference at all, which was the consequence of being dismissed for cause, the servant was effectively locked out of the upper tier of service and reduced to less reputable positions in less careful households. The reference system was thus a form of control that extended beyond the household's walls and across the servant's entire working life. A servant who had given offense, who had answered back, or been found with a follower, or been implicated in a domestic dispute that had ended badly, was at risk not merely of losing the current position but of losing the future ones. This was understood, and the understanding shaped behavior in ways that went well beyond the immediate consequences of any single action. The reference letter itself was a document whose careful language was understood by all parties to communicate far more than it said. A reference that described a servant as honest and hardworking but said nothing about her character or disposition was not a warm reference. A reference that noted she was leaving to better herself said something different from a reference that noted she was leaving for family reasons. The mistress who wrote references understood the code. The mistress who received them understood it equally. And the servant, who was allowed to see the reference or not depending on the household's practice, understood that her future was contained in a document whose language she had not written and might not be permitted to read. The question of the follower, the sweetheart, the romantic attachment that was explicitly forbidden in many households' rules, illuminates the gap between the formal system and the human reality with particular clarity. The prohibition on followers was not universal and not uniformly enforced, but it was common enough to be a significant feature of service life, and its consequences when it was violated, dismissal, usually, sometimes with a reference that mentioned the circumstances and sometimes without, were real and serious. What the rule revealed was the household's claim not merely on the servant's working hours but on the entire character of the servant's personal life. A servant in a position where followers were prohibited was expected not to have a private emotional life that intersected in any way with the household's operations. The household did not prohibit falling in love, it could not, but it prohibited the household being aware of the falling in love, and since the servant had no private space outside the household except on her days off, the prohibition was in practical terms close to a prohibition on the thing itself. Some servants managed it anyway, through correspondence and meetings on days off and the careful compartmentalization of an interior life from a working life that the Victorian household had spent years training them to maintain. The compartmentalization that had been imposed as a professional requirement became, in this context, a personal resource. The same discipline that kept the servant's reactions invisible in the drawing room kept the servant's private life invisible in the household. And some fell afoul of it. The servant dismissed for a follower does not appear in the household's records as a person with a story. She appears as a departure, a notice given, a reference written, a position vacated. The story is in the space between the lines, the weeks of careful concealment, the moment of discovery, the mistress's response, the interview in the housekeeper's room, the packing of the box, the leaving. The packing of the box is its own small story. The servant's possessions in a Victorian household were limited: a few changes of working clothes, the Sunday dress, the Bible, the letters from home, the photograph if there was one, the small personal items that accumulated over years in a single chest of drawers and represented the entirety of a private material life. Packing them took an hour at most. The box was small, the kind of trunk that could be carried by one person, that fitted on the top of a cab, that was the standard unit of a servant's movable life. Everything that was the household's was left behind: the uniform, the apron, the cap, the household assigned items that belonged to the position rather than the person. Everything that was hers she put in the box. The house absorbed the loss of her as it absorbed everything, smoothly, without apparent disturbance, a new person in the position within the week, the room she had cleaned and the fires she had laid and the hot water she had carried up and down the back staircase for months or years redistributed among the remaining staff as the household reorganized itself around her absence. I keep thinking about the leaving, the moment when the servant who had lived in this house for months or years, who had cleaned these rooms and carried these coals and laid this table and perhaps loved this household in the way you love any place that has been your daily world, had to take her box and go out the servant's entrance for the last time. The entrance that faced away from the street. The exit that was, like everything else about service, designed to avoid being seen. There is a particular kind of departure that is sadder than anger would make it and harder than relief would justify, the departure that carries no clear emotional shape, that is simply the end of a chapter in someone's working life, leaving no record beyond a name in the census and a reference letter in a drawer somewhere and the faint impression of a person's presence in rooms that have already been given to someone else to clean. Victorian domestic service contained multitudes of these departures. 1.3 million servants, moving through positions, leaving houses they had helped run, taking their expertise and their memories and their quiet interior lives on to the next household, the next range, the next bell pull, the next morning before the house woke when the time was theirs for a few minutes before the day began again. The house absorbed them all. The house went on. The fires were lit by the next person and the table was laid by the next person and the household performed its invisible labor through another generation of invisible people, and the family, as they were designed to, never quite had to think about any of it. Outside the servant's entrance, the street receives her. The box in her hand is not heavy. She has not, in the way of things, accumulated much. The door closes behind her. The house does not mark the moment. Nothing marks the moment. She walks. By 7 o'clock in the evening, the Victorian house has entered its most elaborate phase. The day's quiet domestic operations, the cleaning, the preparation, the steady maintenance of the household's order, have given way to the social performance for which the entire machinery exists. The family is at dinner, or preparing to be. The house is in its full formal presentation. Every room that matters is lit and warm and correct. The footman in the hall. He stands near the console table, not quite in the center of the space, positioned to be immediately available to the door without being so prominent that his presence is the first thing a visitor notices. He is in full livery if the household maintains it, a coat in the family's colors, knee breeches, white stockings, powdered hair in grander establishments, the full theatrical costume of the formal household's public presentation. He is still. He is prepared to be useful. He is, by the training and the costume and the stillness, performing the Victorian household's definitive version of invisible presence. The family at dinner. The table is laid for however many are eating, the family alone, or with guests on an entertaining evening. The candles on the table are lit and have been burning long enough to be past the waxy white phase and into the steady, warm gold phase that the Victorians associated with an established fire rather than a newly lit one. The centerpiece, flowers in summer, something more elaborate for a formal occasion, is composed and still. Each place is precisely set, the silver polished to a finish that catches and returns the candlelight. The food comes from below. This is the moment when the kitchen's invisible labor becomes the table's visible grace. The clear soup that required a full day's stock making appears in the silver tureen, the footman carrying it in silence, the movement from the serving room to the dining room accomplished in the brief gap between the removal of the table's arrangement and the arrival of the first course. The sequence is managed with the precision of a stage production. not because precision is intrinsically beautiful, though it is, but because imprecision would be noticed and noticing would disturb the performance. The butler oversees the wine. He is present at every stage of the dinner service but rarely in motion, which is the butler's particular version of authoritative presence, still but watchful, the eye that has seen the table so many times that a misaligned glass registers in his peripheral attention without requiring him to look directly at it. The footmen move. The butler observes and occasionally intervenes, a quiet word, a hand adjusted, a correction so small and so smooth that it passes below the family's awareness, which is the point. The wine itself was the butler's domain in a more comprehensive sense than any other aspect of the dinner service. He had chosen it, not on a whim or from a list provided by the family, but from his knowledge of the household cellar, which was his responsibility to maintain and manage. The cellar of a Victorian household of any standing was a significant investment. Bottles of claret and burgundy laid down years earlier to develop, a supply of champagne for occasions requiring it, port for the men's evening ritual, Madeira for the ladies, the various fortified wines and spirits that the Victorian household kept for both consumption and medicinal use. The butler's cellar book recorded every bottle, its acquisition, its price, its expected development, its consumption. The book was maintained with the same methodical precision as the housekeeper's linen inventory, and a butler who managed his cellar well, who knew when to open a bottle and when to wait, who could advise the master on what to serve at a specific occasion without prompting, who kept the cellar at the correct temperature and humidity through the variations of the London seasons, was a butler of particular value. Some butlers were also, in the privacy of the cellar, connoisseurs in a genuine sense. They had developed, over years of professional exposure to good wine, a palate and a knowledge that went beyond the professional requirement. The testing of wine before service, a small but necessary ritual, the butler satisfying himself that a bottle was in the correct condition before it was decanted and brought upstairs, gave him repeated access to the thing he was expert in, and the expertise could become, over time, a form of genuine pleasure that the professional frame only partially described. The serving of wine at the Victorian formal dinner was another performance within the performance, the decanter passing around the table in the correct direction, the amount poured consistent between glasses, the footman's arm appearing at the precise angle at the precise moment to refill without interrupting, the butler's eye on the decanter's level throughout. Wine service was the most visible aspect of the footman's evening work, the moment when his presence was most directly in the family's field of vision, and the invisibility required was therefore the most demanding, present, functional, utterly unremarkable. What the family talks about at dinner, we know from their diaries and letters. They talk about the season, about the people they have seen and the invitations they have received and the gossip of their circle. They talk about politics, about the novels and the exhibitions and the music. About the children. About the relations. About the small and large things of their lives. They talk as people have always talked at tables, freely, personally, with the looseness that food and company produce, and they talk in the presence of the footman and the butler and do not think about this because they have been not thinking about it their entire lives. The footman carries what he carries. He hears what he hears. The professional discipline holds. The conversation continues. After dinner, the family withdraws. In the Victorian formal tradition, the women withdraw first to the drawing room while the men remain at the table with their port and their cigars, a division that lasted about half an hour in most households before the men joined the women for coffee and the evening's conversation or entertainment. During this half hour, the dining room was cleared, efficiently, quietly, the cloths folded with precision and carried below, the silver transferred to the butler's pantry for overnight cleaning, the candles extinguished in the correct order, and the room was restored to its daytime state, empty and correct, prepared to wake again at the same time tomorrow. The drawing room in the evening was the Victorian household social centerpiece, the room where the family's life was performed for itself, where conversation happened, where the piano was played if anyone in the household played, where guests were received and entertained, where books were read and needlework done and the particular comfortable idleness of a Victorian evening was allowed to develop at its own pace. The servant's presence in the drawing room during the evening was managed differently from the servant's presence during the day. The fire needed to be attended, coal added, the grate poked into a better drawer when the fire was sulking, but the fire-tending servant was in the room with the family, which required a particular quality of movement, quiet, peripheral, accomplished in the brief pause of attention that the conversation always eventually provided, gone before the conversation resumed. The coffee tray arrived at some point in the evening, carried in by a parlour maid or a footman, set on the low table near the mistress's chair, poured if required, removed when the cups had been emptied. These movements were the drawing room's evening grammar, small entrances and exits, each one timed and smooth, the room's social life continuing around them without break. The drawing room piano, if someone in the household played. This is a small detail but one that changes the quality of the evening. Victorian parlour music, the songs and dances and sentimental ballads that formed the repertoire of a reasonably accomplished amateur performer, filled the drawing room in the hours after dinner with a sound that was different from conversation, different from silence, different from the sound of any of the other rooms in the house. The music drifted through the house in the way sounds do in tall narrow buildings, penetrating floors and finding the back staircase, reaching the kitchen corridor below in a muffled, intermittent form. The servants heard it. They did not attend it, in any formal sense. The drawing room was not open to them in the evening as a social space. But the music was present in the house in a way that bypassed the household's careful systems of separation, reaching the basement kitchen and the servants' hall without requiring permission. A cook finishing the evening's clearing, hearing a ballad she knew by its tune if not by its words, was receiving something from the family's evening that the architecture had not arranged to send her. Whether this was a small kindness or a small reminder of separation, or whether it was simply the natural behavior of sound in a building and neither more nor less than that, depends on the individual and the household and the evening. Some of the oral histories mention the music. Some mention it warmly. One woman, interviewed in the 1950s about her years as a kitchen maid in a house in Somerset, said that the music on the evenings when the family was at home was the thing she missed most when she left service, and she said it with the specific precision of someone describing not a sentimental attachment but an actual sensory experience that had been part of her daily life and whose absence was real. The last thing the servant does in the drawing room, when the family has finally gone upstairs, is stand in it for a moment alone. This is not a prescribed part of the evening's duties. It is simply the necessary pause before the clearing, the moment when the room still holds the warmth of the evening's fire and the small evidence of the evening's life. The cups on the tray, the book left open on the arm of a chair, the cushion displaced by an evening of sitting. She looks at this, not studying it, just registering it in the way that people register the rooms they are responsible for, with a kind of proprietary awareness that is not ownership but that partakes of something ownership-like, the attention of someone who has this room in their keeping. Then the work begins, the fire banked, the lamps extinguished, the cups on the tray to the kitchen, the cushions set straight, the book closed and replaced on its shelf, the room returned to its resting order. The last lamp out. The room dark. She pulls the door closed behind her. The drawing room is ready for tomorrow. The family is upstairs. The house is entering its night. The back staircase in the dark. She knows it well enough that she does not need to hold the rope with both hands, one hand, lightly, the feet certain on the worn treads. The gas jets have been turned down to their lowest setting and the staircase is lit by a faint bluish glow that makes everything slightly unreal, gives the plain whitewashed walls a quality they do not have in full light. The kitchen below is quieter now. The range is banked. The cook has gone up. The scullery maid finished the last of the washing up an hour ago. The kitchen table is clear, its white scrubbed surface pale in the low light from the area window. The smell of the kitchen in the evening, after the day's cooking, with the range banked and cooling slightly, the stock reduced to a quiet presence, the warmth still radiating from the iron, is different from the smell of it in the morning. The end of the day's production rather than its beginning. The attic. The servants' sleeping floor, which in most Victorian townhouses occupied the top story under the roof. Small rooms with sloping ceilings on one side where the roof came down to the eaves. A dormer window in each room, facing the backs of the houses behind. Cold in winter, warm in summer, always slightly apart from the rest of the house in temperature and in feeling. The beds were narrow and hard by modern standards, but they were each servant's own in the sense that no one else slept in them and the servant's few private possessions could be kept in the small chest at the foot without any particular risk. A room of one's own, even a cold attic room with a sloping ceiling, was a form of possession that mattered in a working life that offered very little space that was uncontested and unobserved. The window looks out over the backs of houses. Lights in other windows, slowly going out one by one as the city's night deepens. The night air coming in through the gap in the window frame, cold, smelling of coal smoke and the river. She is asleep before she has thought about being tired. The morning will come at 5. The range will need to be lit. The house will need to be ready. It always is. The Victorian servant system, for all its apparent solidity, for all the architecture built to support it, the manuals written to describe it, the social arrangements predicated on it, was ending even as it reached its greatest extent. The last decade of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th century saw the beginning of a transformation whose speed, once it started, surprised everyone who had assumed that a system so deeply embedded in the social order was permanent. The signals were there in the 1880s and 1890s for those who were paying attention. The Elementary Education Acts of the 1870s, which established the framework for universal primary education in England, were beginning to produce by the 1880s a generation of working-class girls who could read, who had been educated to have slightly different expectations about their lives, who were looking at the available options and sometimes finding domestic service, with its constraints and its invisibility and its near-total absorption of personal life into the household's requirements, less obviously attractive than factory work or shop work, which at least offered evenings at home and Sundays free. The servant problem, as it was called in the household management literature and the middle-class press of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, was the problem of finding good servants, of filling the positions that households required with the quality of person that the system depended on. The servant problem is first clearly named in the 1880s and it grows louder in each subsequent decade, reaching a crescendo in the Edwardian period and then becoming something much more acute in the years after the First World War. The tone of these complaints is interesting. The household management journals and the letters pages of the middle-class press in the Edwardian period are full of a particular quality of bafflement, the sense that something which had always worked, which had been the natural order of things, was developing a fault that no one could quite identify or repair. The servants available were not of the old quality. They were impertinent. They gave notice too easily. They were not willing to learn the old ways. They had ideas about their time that were incompatible with the requirements of a properly run household. What the complainants were observing, without being able to name it as such, was the beginning of the end of a supply of labor that had been produced by a very specific set of social and economic conditions, conditions that were quietly changing. When the alternative to service was the factory or the street corner, service offered a form of security that made its constraints bearable. When the alternatives expanded, when shop work and factory work and clerical work became available to women who had previously had no choice but service, the equation changed. And the households that had depended on the old equation found themselves facing a market for domestic labor that was behaving in ways the market for domestic labor had not, within living memory, behaved. The First World War was the break point. 1914 to 1918 took the men of the serving classes into uniform, the footmen and the hall boys and the butlers' assistants, the grooms and the stable boys, and took the women into munitions factories, into clerical work, into nursing, into the auxiliary services. Women who had been housemaids found themselves doing work that was different in kind from service, work that was harder in some respects, certainly more dangerous, but work that paid more and that ended when the shift ended and that did not require you to live in someone else's house under someone else's rules and to be, professionally, invisible. When the war ended in 1918, some of these women returned to service. Many did not. The households that had managed without full staff through the war years found they could continue to manage with fewer servants. In households that were deliberately smaller and simpler than the Victorian ideal, in a period when the tax burden on large incomes had increased substantially and the maintenance of 20-room houses with full staffs had become economically difficult for all but the wealthiest. The 1920s saw a precipitous decline in domestic service numbers. The 1931 census showed a drop of nearly 1 million from the Victorian peak. By the 1950s, the full-staff Victorian household was effectively extinct outside a small number of the grandest aristocratic houses, and even those had reduced their staffs to a fraction of their pre-war size. The country house that had employed 40 servants in 1890 employed 4 in 1950, and by the later 20th century had often been given to the National Trust or converted to a school or a hotel or simply closed up and left to manage its own decline. The technology that replaced the servant was developed in parallel with the servant's departure, electric light that replaced the lamplighter's round, gas and later electric cooking that replaced the range and its daily demands, central heating that replaced the room-by-room fire-laying, hot and cold running water that replaced the copper can carried up the back staircase. These technologies arrived at different rates in different households, but their direction was constant and their effect cumulative, and by the middle of the 20th century the domestic infrastructure that had required a team of 6 or 8 to maintain could be managed by one person, or two, or by the family itself. This was experienced as liberation by the women who had been in service and the women who might otherwise have had to enter it. The freedom from the household's total claim on one's time in life and personal expression was real and significant and was understood to be a form of social progress by virtually everyone who observed it. What ended was something more specific and more difficult to name. The Victorian household had been a form of organization with a particular relationship to care, the production of daily physical comfort, the maintenance of the domestic environment, the management of food and cleanliness and warmth, that was performed by a large group of people whose entire professional capacity was devoted to it. The expertise that accumulated in those people over decades of service, the cook's knowledge of the range, the housekeeper's management of the linen inventory, the housemaid's calibrated timing of the morning sequence, was real, specific, hard-won, and when it dispersed without leaving a record. This is not an argument for the system. The system was built on an arrangement of power that required significant numbers of people to subordinate their entire daily lives to other people's comfort, in exchange for wages that were modest and conditions that were constrained in ways that would now be considered unacceptable. The ending of that system was right. But the ending of systems that are built on exploitation does not automatically preserve the knowledge that was generated within them, and the knowledge of Victorian domestic practice, practical, embodied, accumulated over generations, was knowledge of a genuine kind, and it went largely unrecorded and largely lost. Jane Austen, interviewed in 1956, was one of a generation of women whose knowledge of how to keep a large Victorian household running was in the process of becoming historical artifact. She knew how to black arrange and make pastry and manage a staff and read the drawing room at the end of the evening and understand from the state of it what the family's mood had been. She knew things that had no application in the world she was growing old in and that were not being learned by anyone new. Within a generation of her interview, the knowledge itself would be largely gone. What remained were the houses. The physical fabric of Victorian domestic life, the back staircases and the basement kitchens and the servants' bells and the service passages, survived in the houses that survived, preserved sometimes deliberately and sometimes simply because the cost of removing them was not worth incurring. Walking through these spaces now, you encounter the system's physical residue, the worn center of the back staircase tread, polished by the feet of people climbing it before 6 in the morning with heavy cans, for years and years until the wood kept the memory of their passing. The line of bell indicators in the corridor, still in their places, the little labels in copperplate, drawing room, morning room, master bedroom. Silent now, but once the nervous system of a particular way of life. The National Trust properties where the servant world has been most carefully preserved, Erdic, where the family had an unusual tradition of commissioning portraits of their servants and writing verses about them, Lanhydrock, where the service wing has been maintained so completely that you can walk through the kitchen and the scullery and the larder and the servants' hall and understand, spatially and sensory, what the working day felt like. These places do something that history books cannot quite do, which is to make the physical reality present. You stand in the kitchen at Lanhydrock and the range is there, the massive iron range with its warming ovens and its boilers and its blackened surfaces, and the smell, even now, with no fire burning, still carries something of what it must have carried when it was lit, iron and old cooking and the particular mineral smell of well-used metal. These spaces are important not as nostalgia. The Victorian household system was deeply problematic in ways that its physical beauty cannot disguise, but as evidence. Evidence that this happened, here, in this building, in this way, performed by people whose names are mostly lost and whose faces are mostly unknown and whose daily experience of their own lives was, by the system's careful design, almost entirely unrecorded. Almost entirely. Not entirely. There is Jane Austen and her 68 pages of transcript in Bradford. There are the oral histories gathered in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s by researchers who understood what they were doing, who understood that the generation they were interviewing carried knowledge that would not be replaced. There are the memoirs, some published and many more unpublished, sitting in local archives and family collections, written in the evenings of the retirement years by women who had been housemaids or cooks or ladies' maids and who wanted, before the end, to say that they had been there. That they had done this. That it had happened and that they had been the people it happened to. One such memoir, unpublished, held in a county archive in Hampshire, was written by a woman who had been a housemaid and later a parlour maid in 2 Edwardian households between 1907 and 1916, before she left service to do war work and never returned. She wrote the memoir in her late 60s, in the early 1950s, in the spare bedroom of the terraced house she had occupied with her husband since their marriage in 1920. She writes without self-pity and without bitterness and with a quality of attention to specific detail that suggests she had been carrying these memories very carefully for a long time and was glad at last to set them down somewhere. She describes the particular quality of winter light in the basement kitchen of her first position, coming down through the area window in the morning in a thin grey bar that moved across the kitchen table as the hours passed and that she used, early in her service, as a kind of clock, watching its angle to gauge the time when she was too busy to consult the clock on the mantel. She describes the smell of the back staircase at her second position, a mixture of beeswax and something faintly animal from the carpet that had been laid on the first few treads and then gave out, leaving the upper reaches uncarpeted. She describes the sound the mangle made in the laundry on Monday mornings, a rhythmic, grinding sound that she can still hear, she writes, if she is very still. This is the record of a life lived inside a system that tried to make it invisible. The system did not succeed. She was there. She remembered. She wrote it down. We kept those houses. And they never quite knew it was us. There is a particular quality that the rooms of a Victorian house carry, even now, that has nothing to do with period furniture or original wallpaper or the preservation of historical finishes. It is the quality of accumulated use, of a space that has been lived in and worked in for a very long time by a great many people in a very specific way. You find it in the worn sill of the basement window where the cook rested her arms on summer evenings when the kitchen was too hot and a few minutes of outside air was possible. In the faint groove on the edge of the kitchen table where the same tasks were performed in the same spot for decades, the knife always drawn across the same surface, the bread always cut in the same corner. These marks are not romantic. They are simply what time looks like when it inhabits a surface. But they are also something else. They are the material residue of specific actions performed by specific people who are otherwise unrecorded. The groove in the table does not preserve the cook's name. It preserves the gesture, the action of the hand moving across this edge in this direction for this purpose, repeated until the surface remembered. Material memory. The Victorians did not call it this and might not have understood the phrase, but they lived inside it in a way that we live inside it less, because they lived in the same houses for longer and accumulated more of it in more surfaces. The housekeeper's room at a house that has been continuously inhabited since 1860 carries the decisions of every housekeeper who sat in it, the particular arrangement of the desk that was found to work best, the hook on the wall where the key ring was always hung, the chair whose leg was repaired by a village carpenter and has a slightly different color at the joint ever since. What is it that we are actually looking at, when we look at these surfaces? We are looking at the accumulated cost of care. The care that a Victorian household required, the daily, hourly, minute-by-minute attention to surfaces and temperatures and arrangements and timings and the thousand small requirements of a large domestic establishment, left these marks the way any significant labor leaves marks, on the tools and the surfaces and the spaces where the labor was performed. The care was not acknowledged in the household's formal systems. It was acknowledged in the surfaces. The surfaces did what the Victorian household social architecture could not. They received the impression of the work and held it. I think about this when I think about what was lost when the Victorian household system ended, when the servants left and the large houses were reduced and the social architecture that had required a cook and a housemaid and a lady's maid and a butler to maintain collapsed into the smaller, flatter, more modest domestic arrangements of the 20th century. What was lost was not the system was worth losing, for the freedoms its ending produced. What was lost was the accumulated embodied knowledge that the system had generated, the cook's knowledge of the range, the housemaid's calibrated timing, the butler's understanding of the wine cellar, the housekeeper's management of the linen room. This knowledge was not written down in a form that survived the transition. The manuals preserved the instructions but not the knowing, not the feel of the range at the right temperature, not the particular resistance of well-ironed linen under the hands, not the way a table laid correctly looks different from a table that is merely correct. These things lived in bodies, in the trained hands and calibrated senses of people who had spent years learning them, and when those bodies were no longer employed in that kind of learning, the knowledge dissolved. There is a woman, she appears in one of the late oral history collections, interviewed in her 80s in the early 1980s, her name given only as Mrs. Hartley, who was a housemaid in a Yorkshire house from 1911 to 1919, before she married and left service. The interviewer asks her what she thinks has been lost from domestic life in the decades since her service. She thinks for a moment and then she says something that has stayed with me. She says that what has been lost is the daily practice of doing ordinary things properly. Not correctly. Properly. The distinction matters, and she is careful with it. Correctly means according to the rule, in conformity with the standard. Properly means something more than this. It means with the full attention and care that the thing deserves, done in the way that it needs to be done to be truly done, not merely completed. She is describing a quality of domestic practice, a mode of engagement with the daily maintenance of a house, that the Victorian household system had enforced through its professional standards and that its ending had allowed to lapse. She is not nostalgic for the system. She is clear about this. The system was bad for people like her in ways that the quality of the daily practice did not compensate for. But she is registering a genuine loss, a loss of something that had existed within the system and that did not automatically survive its ending. The thing she is describing is something like craft. The craft of domestic practice, the accumulated skill and care that make a well-run household something more than merely functional, that make its daily maintenance a form of competence rather than just a sequence of tasks. The cook who produced not merely food but food of a particular quality, with the knowledge and care that quality requires. The housemaid who maintained not merely a clean house but a house whose maintenance was itself a form of order, regular, careful, attentive to the particular requirements of each surface and each space. This craft was invisible in the Victorian household for the same reason everything else was invisible. The system required invisibility, and the invisibility extended to the quality of the work as well as the fact of it. A perfectly laid table was simply what a table looked like. The work required to make it look that way was absorbed into the background condition of the household, available to be commented on only when it failed to appear. This is perhaps the deepest irony in the Victorian servant story. The higher the quality of the work, the less it was seen. Perfect service was invisible service. The better the cook, the more seamlessly the food appeared without anyone thinking about cooking. The better the housemaid, the more naturally the rooms were always clean and warm and ready. The system's ideal was a household so smoothly run that its running required no attention whatsoever, and every approach toward this ideal was an approach toward perfect invisibility. The people who lived inside this system, who spent their working lives becoming more and more invisible the better they became at their work, maintained their visibility in the only spaces where the system could not reach them. In their interior lives, which were their own. In the servants' hall conversations, which were among themselves. In the letters they wrote home and the letters they received. In the Sunday afternoon hours that were their own time, in which they could be as visible and as present and as fully themselves as any person whose daily professional existence required something less. And in the oral history transcripts, which are perhaps the most unexpected form of preservation available to them. Jane Austen, speaking into a microphone in 1956, at 92 years old, describing the smell of the kitchen on winter mornings and the cook who showed her how to test the custard and the mistress in Leeds who arranged for the lending library subscription and the particular quality of Sunday afternoon in the servants' hall when the house was quiet. These details, recorded on tape and transcribed onto paper and preserved in an archive in Bradford, are the evidence of a life that was lived inside a system designed not to see it. The tape recorded what the household could not. The archive preserves what the architecture erased. The transcript, 68 pages long, typed in a slightly uneven font on paper that has yellowed at the edges, is the space where Jane Austen is visible, fully, specifically, humanly visible, in a way that the Victorian household never allowed her to be. The women who wrote their own memoirs, unpublished, sitting in local archives, written in spare bedrooms and small front parlors by women in their 60s and 70s who were setting things down before it was too late, were doing something similar. They were making a record of their own visibility. Not asking to be remembered in any large or formal way. Not seeking acknowledgement of the kind the household had withheld. Just setting it down, I was here. This is what I did. This is what it was like. Someone should know. The housemaid whose memoir is in the Hampshire archive describes, near the end of her account, the particular satisfaction of completing the drawing room on a winter morning before the family came down. The fire newly laid, the grate freshly polished, the furniture dusted, the floor swept, the ornaments replaced in their places, the room in its state of impeccable readiness, the winter light just beginning to come through the windows and giving the room a quality it had at no other time of day, blue and clean and still, before anyone had entered it and made it merely a used room again. This is the room at its best, she writes. This is the room as it was before it was interrupted by the day. She does not say she loved it. She does not say she was proud of it. Those are not words the service life gave ready access to. But the description carries what the words did not say, the pride and the attention and the specific quality of satisfaction that comes from making something right, from bringing a room to the condition it ought to be in, from doing the ordinary things so well that for one morning in winter it is something close to beautiful. We kept those houses. The words again. Quiet and exact and carrying more weight the longer they sit. They did. And we know it now, which is the only form of acknowledgement available across the distance of 150 years, not sufficient, not what the work deserved in its time, but real. A form of seeing, however belated. A form of presence, however late in coming. The archive receives the tape. The transcript holds the voice. The worn tread of the back staircase holds the foot. There is something else I want to tell you about the things that lasted, and it is this: the knowledge lasted too, in a form. Not in the manuals and not in any formal record, but in the women who had the knowledge and who carried it into the rest of their lives, into the households they ran as wives and mothers, into the boarding houses and the tea rooms and the small domestic businesses that many former servants established with the savings of their working years. The practical education of a Victorian household was a real education, and it did not evaporate when the apron came off. The woman who had been a cook for 15 years and who opened a boarding house in the seaside town where her sister lived brought to that enterprise a body of knowledge that no formal training program could have produced more efficiently. She knew how to calculate food costs for a varying number of guests. She knew how to manage a kitchen's time so that multiple dishes came to completion at the same moment. She knew how to buy provisions in the quantities that minimized waste without running short. She knew how to assess the quality of produce at the market and how to negotiate with the supplier whose prices were always a little high but whose deliveries were always reliable. She knew, in short, everything that the running of a small catering business required, because she had been doing a more complex version of it for 15 years without anyone calling it management. The housekeeper who retired to her village was similarly equipped. She had managed household budgets of a scale that dwarfed what her retirement required. She had managed staff, resolved disputes, maintained inventory, negotiated with suppliers, handled the household's accounts, corresponded with tradespeople, managed the household's complex domestic economy across multiple departments. She brought all of this into the quieter management of a small household of her own, where its scale was different but its principles were the same. I think about what this means in terms of the Victorian household's relationship to the women who worked in it. The system was exploitative in the formal economic sense. The wages were low relative to the work, the hours were long, the autonomy was severely limited, the power relations were heavily weighted against the servant. All of this is true and worth naming. But the system also provided, as a byproduct of its exploitation, a practical education of remarkable depth and breadth to a large number of women who would otherwise have had no access to any comparable training. The working-class girl who entered service at 13 and left at 30 had spent 17 years acquiring knowledge and skills that would serve her for the rest of her life. The acquisition was painful and the terms were unfair. The knowledge was real. This is one of the uncomfortable complexities of the Victorian servant story that easy narratives about oppression and liberation can flatten. The service life was genuinely limiting in important ways. It was also, for many women, the best available education. Both things were true simultaneously, and the women who lived through it understood this. Understood it with the particular clarity of people who have no luxury of abstraction because the concrete reality of their situation is too immediate. Mrs. Hartley, who described the loss of doing things properly, was not describing a loss she was glad to have suffered. She was describing something that she had possessed and that the world she retired into had less use for. The craft of domestic practice, the careful, attentive, skilled maintenance of a household, did not transfer entirely into a world where the household was smaller and simpler and the time available to it was fractioned between the domestic and the paid work that 20th century economics required of working-class women. The craft diminished because the conditions that had produced and required it had changed. Not disappeared. The careful housewife who ironed her sheets and kept her kitchen spotless and maintained her household with a precision that her neighbors found excessive was preserving something of this tradition into the post-service world. But diminished, as the scale contracted and the time available contracted with it, and the professional standards that had enforced the craft in the service context were replaced by the more flexible standards of the private home. What we have instead are the records. The oral history transcripts in the local archives. The memoirs in their cardboard boxes. The photograph albums that some households kept, with the servants photographed at the back door or in the servants' hall, their faces sometimes clear and sometimes blurred by the imperfect technology of early domestic photography, their expressions often the careful neutrality of people who were not certain how to be seen. And the houses themselves, carrying in their surfaces the material memory of a way of life that left marks precisely because it was so thoroughly lived inside. The worn step. The groove in the table. The hook on the wall. The scuff on the basement door from 10,000 departures with coal scuttles and mop buckets. These are the monuments of the Victorian servant, and they are not grand, and they are not preserved in any formal sense. They are simply there, in the fabric of the buildings, until the buildings are replaced or renovated and the marks are smoothed away. They are the most honest record available. The record of action, of presence, of work performed in specific places over long stretches of time by people who were, while they performed it, invisible. We can see them now. The marks they left are the form of seeing available to us, partial, material, silent. But present. The archive and the worn tread and the transcript. They were here. They kept these houses. And the houses, in the only language available to buildings, held the record. It is late now. The house is as quiet as it gets, which in a Victorian household is not entirely quiet. Houses of this age, these materials, this size, always have a small ongoing conversation of sounds. The settling of the timber as the night temperature drops, the faint pop and tick of the range cooling in the kitchen below, the muffled sound of the city that is always present, somewhere, in a London house, like a very low note played continuously at the edge of hearing. The family is asleep. The master and mistress in their separate rooms. Separate bedrooms were the norm in middle and upper-class Victorian households, a practice that modern sensibility finds odd but that made a straightforward domestic sense in a world where bedrooms were also dressing rooms, morning rooms for private correspondence, spaces for individual occupation that the shared bedroom could not accommodate. The children are in the nursery floor, under the nurse's care, breathing the quiet breath of children who have spent their day in the particular total occupation of childhood and who have nothing left but sleep. The house is arranged around the sleeping of the people it was built to serve. The servants are asleep too, or most of them. The butler has made his final circuit of the lower floor, the back door, the scullery window, the coal cellar door, each checked in the sequence he has performed every night for however many years he has been in this house. He is in his pantry, which in this household is also his bedroom, a small room smelling of silver polish and the remains of the fire he was allowed in his room that has now burned to a quiet glow. He sleeps with a precision born of the habit of rising early, not restlessly, not lightly, but with the exact depth that allows him to be fully awake when he needs to be without overshooting into the heavy morning sleep that makes the early rise difficult. This is one of the small disciplines of a service life, the regulation of sleep to the household's requirements, the training of the body to wake at a particular time without alarm, to sleep to a depth appropriate to the hours available without the luxury of the long, undisciplined rest that other lives allow. The housekeeper is in her room on the first floor of the servants' wing, adjacent to the main house but distinct from it, the room of someone with intermediate status, neither fully below stairs nor upstairs, occupying the transitional space that her role in the household describes. Her keys are on the hook beside the door. Her desk has her accounts on it, the quarterly record she will present to the mistress next week, the figures neat and clear in the black ink she uses for official documentation. The accounts tell the household story in a language the family rarely read carefully, the cost of provisions week by week, the fluctuations in the price of coal and candles and soap and the various cleaning materials that maintain the household surfaces. The housekeeping accounts are one of the most intimate documents of Victorian domestic life precisely because they are so practical, so unmediated by social performance. The family's life, reduced to its constituent costs. What it took, materially, to be comfortable. What every candle, every pound of soap, every quarter bushel of coal, added up to over a year. The cook is in the room she has occupied for 16 years, at the end of the servants' corridor on the attic floor, the room with the best window. She chose it early in her tenure here, when the upper housemaid who had occupied it left to be married, and the housekeeper had allowed the choice as a small recognition of seniority. The window looks east. In the summer it wakes her with the light before 5. In the winter it shows her the slow graying of the sky that tells her it is close to time. She has been in this house for 16 years. She knows it in a way that the family who owns it does not, knows the rain's particular character on cold mornings and the larder's temperature in different seasons and the way the scullery drains slowly in heavy rain and the particular sound the coal delivery makes when it comes down the area chute on Tuesdays. She knows the kitchen's history in the way that people know places they have inhabited long enough, not just the current state of things but the record of how they have been, the layers of use and change and continuity that make a familiar space something more than its current arrangement. She will probably leave this house eventually, not soon, but eventually. Cooks moved when the opportunity came, when a better position presented itself or when the household reduced and the position became less interesting or when the long familiarity of a single household began to feel like stagnation rather than rootedness. She has thought about it. She has not acted on the thinking. The house knows her, she knows the house, and there is a kind of comfort in that mutual knowing that is not affection exactly but that is real and that she is not indifferent to. The housemaids, the kitchen maid, the scullery maid, the attic floor's smaller rooms, each with its narrow bed and its small chest and its sloped ceiling and its window on the city's back. They sleep deeply, the way people sleep when the day has been genuinely full, the physical exhaustion of people who have spent the day lifting and carrying and bending and scrubbing and standing, whose bodies have done real work and know it. Ellen is 13 months older than when we first met her this morning. Not in the story's time. In the story's time, it is still the same day, the same November, the same morning to evening arc of a single household day. But in reality, the Ellen who arrived in the kitchen before dawn and the Ellen who climbs to the attic room now have a year of mornings between them, a year of ranges and coal scuttles and hot water cans and the particular education of a working life that no one is officially teaching her but that is entering her knowledge every day regardless. She has learned the range. She can tell its temperature now in the way the cook told her she would eventually be able to tell it, not by measurement but by proximity, by the slight easing of the air near the oven door, by something in the quality of the heat itself that her hands have learned to read. She has learned the timing of the morning sequence with a precision that approaches the upper housemaid's, which is the benchmark she holds herself to without anyone having told her this is the benchmark. She has learned which step on the back staircase creaks and how to step past it, which floorboard in the passage outside the kitchen has a hollow sound underfoot, which of the bell indicators swings longest after the drawing-room bell is rung. She has not been told that these are things worth knowing. She has learned them the way all deep learning happens, by being present for the thing, repeatedly, over time, until the thing is simply part of what she knows. The Victorian household did not provide formal training for its servants in the modern sense. It provided the conditions in which a particular kind of learning became inevitable: immersion, repetition, correction, and the gradual accumulation of embodied knowledge that no amount of instruction could produce as efficiently as simple sustained presence. When she wakes tomorrow at 5, she will know what she is doing before she is fully conscious of knowing it. The body will move toward the range before the mind has finished orienting itself to the morning. This is the form that skill takes when it has been thoroughly learned. It descends below the level of deliberate action into the deeper register where the body acts and the mind follows, or does not need to follow because the action is already happening correctly. The house settles around them. It is performing, in this quiet hour, the one function that it performs without any human management at all. It is simply being the container of all of this: the sleeping family, the sleeping servants, the range with its banked fire, the locked silver in the butler's pantry, the keys in the housekeeper's room, the row of bells in the corridor that will begin ringing again at 7:30 tomorrow morning. The architecture of invisibility holds all of them, family and servants alike, in its geometry of separation. The back staircase is dark. The service corridor is empty. The bell indicators are still on their hooks, their labels in copperplate just legible in the faint ambient light from the street. Morning room. Drawing room. Library. Silent until morning, when the household will wake in its two halves and resume the careful parallel performance of two lives in one building. You are here, in this house, in this moment. You have spent a long time in it tonight: the basement kitchen and the back staircase and the servants' hall and the still room and the drawing room and the attic floor. You have met Ellen and Jane Alden and the cook who knew the range and the housekeeper with her keys and the lady's maid in the sewing room with her needle. You have heard the bell pull and the sound of the mangle and the particular creak of the servants' staircase on the third tread. It is a strange thing to carry, this knowledge. Not heavy, exactly, but present. The knowledge that a very large portion of Victorian domestic life was performed by people whose entire professional existence was organized around the principle of their own absence, who mastered the art of being there without being seen, of doing work that was only noticed when it was not done, of maintaining a household whose smooth operation depended entirely on their constant invisible effort. And the knowledge that they were people, fully, completely, in all the ways that matter. People with interior lives and Sunday afternoons and lending library subscriptions and letters from home and the accumulating knowledge of a range and the particular satisfaction of a table laid correctly and the small moments of warmth in kitchens that were their kitchens in every sense that mattered except the former one. The house is very quiet. The range has gone to its minimum warmth, the banked coals just barely alive. The bells are still. The back staircase is dark. In a few hours the morning will begin again: the coal scuttle, the range, the sequence of invisible preparations, the house made ready. But not yet. For now the house rests, and the night holds everything in its quiet, and the story has come to its end, which is really only the pause between one morning and the next. Let it carry you toward sleep. The sounds of the house settling around you, small, familiar, ordinary. The warmth of wherever you are lying. The weight of your own body, comfortable in its place. Nothing is required of you now. Nothing needs doing. Everything that needed doing today has been done. The range is banked. The bells are still. The morning is hours away. The servants are asleep in the attic and the family is asleep on the upper floors and the house holds them all in the equal darkness of the night. You are in the house and the house is quiet and the night is deep and everything that needed doing today has been done by people who were very good at what they did and who were, most of them, never quite given credit for it. Sleep now. Sleep well. The range is banked. The fire in every grate has gone to its minimum. The candles in the sconces along the upstairs corridor have burned down to their holders and been extinguished by the last footman to walk the passage tonight. The gas lamps in the street outside throw their faint orange light through the gap in the area curtains, a thin stripe of it on the kitchen wall that will be there until morning, changing its angle as the night proceeds and the gas pressure varies slightly in the small hours. This is the house in its most honest state. During the day it performs, for the family, for visitors, for the various purposes that a Victorian household served in its social context. But now, in the deep of the November night, with everyone asleep and no performance required, the house is simply itself. Its rooms are what they are. Its passages are dark. Its bells are silent on their hooks. There is a quality to the silence of a large Victorian house at this hour that is worth noticing, if you can. Not the silence of emptiness, the house is full of sleeping people, but the silence of suspension, of a very complex system held momentarily at rest. All day it has been in motion, the bells, the fires, the footsteps on the back staircase, the doors opening and closing, the kitchen's heat and noise, the drawing room's quiet management, the dining room's formal evening. And now all of that has stopped, and the house holds its breath, and the night settles in around it. Ellen is asleep. Her sleep is deep and immediate, the way the sleep of someone who has worked a 14-hour day in cold conditions is always deep and immediate. She does not dream, or if she dreams she will not remember it. In the morning she will wake at 5, and the morning will be the morning, and the sequence will begin again, and she will do it in the slightly more competent way she does everything now compared to when she arrived here, because the learning continues even when she is not aware of it continuing. She is 13 years old and she is already, in the particular vocabulary of the Victorian household, becoming a servant, meaning not just that she holds the position of scullery maid but that the position is entering her, shaping the way she moves and the way she times her actions and the way she navigates the house's geography of permitted and not permitted spaces. In 10 years she may be a kitchen maid, perhaps a cook's assistant, perhaps, if the trajectory holds and the opportunities arise, a cook in her own right in some other household. Or she may leave service, as so many did in those final decades of the Victorian era, drawn by the new possibilities that were beginning to open. The factories, the shops, the offices, the expanding service sector of a modernizing city where young women could earn wages in contexts that did not require invisibility. She does not know this yet. She knows the range and the coal scuttle and the back staircase and the particular creak of the third tread. She knows the cook's voice when it is impatient and when it is merely tired. She knows that the family exists in another part of the house and that her work is what makes their existence in that other part of the house possible, and she knows this not as an abstract principle but as the concrete daily reality of her work. She sleeps. The house settles. The minutes pass in their unhurried way. The housekeeper's accounts are on the desk. The butler's keys are on the hook. The linen is in the press and the silver is in the locked cupboard and the wine is in the cellar and the coal is in the bunker and the kindling is laid in every grate for the morning and everything that needs to be ready for tomorrow morning is ready for tomorrow morning. This is what the invisible work produced. This state of readiness, this condition of the house at rest with everything in its place. You would not know, arriving in this house for the first time tomorrow morning, how much had been required to bring it to this state. You would simply find the house as it is, warm enough, clean, ordered, prepared. The work that produced this state is not present to be seen. It is absorbed into the condition of the house, dissolved into its ordinariness, which was the whole point. I have been thinking, while we have been in this house together, about what it means to do work that is only noticed when it is not done. There is a particular psychological cost to this, a cost that the Victorian household imposed on its servants as systematically as it imposed the early rising and the cold floors and the regulated hours. The cost of invisibility is not just social. It is cognitive. When the work you do disappears into the background of other people's lives, when the standard of success is the absence of any trace that you were there, you develop a relationship to your own effort that is different from the relationship of someone whose work is acknowledged. You learn to measure your success by an absence. The clean room, which means you were not seen to have cleaned it. The smooth meal service, which means no one was aware of how complex it had been to produce. The fire that was there when needed, which means no one was thinking about the cold it replaced. You become skilled at producing conditions rather than objects, at creating states rather than things, at maintaining an environment rather than making a product. And this kind of work, which is, in a certain sense, the highest form of housekeeping, the form in which the household truly runs itself, leaves no record except the record of the conditions it produced. The house itself is the record. This quiet, ordered, still house. The range that is banked correctly so that the morning fire will catch from it. The area steps that are swept. The front door whose brass is polished and whose lock is oiled and whose step is whitened. The drawing room that is laid for tomorrow's use, the furniture in its places, the fire set in the grate. Every room in this house is the accumulated result of daily care, daily attention, daily work performed by people who were very good at it and who will never, in any formal sense, be given credit for what they made. This is the house as it is. This is the night as it is. This is the story as it ends, not with a conclusion, because the Victorian household does not have a conclusion, it only has the morning and the morning after the morning and the slow procession of days that a working life in service constituted. Let the house hold you in its quiet. Let the ranged residual warmth be yours for a moment. Let the darkness be the comfortable darkness of a house at rest, of a day completed, of work done in full. The bells are silent. The back staircase is dark. The morning is hours away. Sleep now. The house is quiet now. You have come all the way through it, from the basement kitchen before dawn, through the service corridors and the back staircase and the servants' hall and the drawing room and the attic, and you have arrived, as all long journeys through houses eventually arrive, at the still point at the end of the evening, where the work is done and the household rests and the night belongs to no one in particular. Let the sounds of the house settle around you. They are small sounds, the small domestic sounds of a building that has been lived in and cared for, that holds its history in its timber and its stone. The subtle sound of the night air against the glass. The particular quality of silence in a room that has been warm all day and is now slowly cooling to its resting temperature. You do not need to carry anything from this story into sleep. It has already gone where it needed to go, into the quiet part of the mind where things rest without being held, where the people and the places and the small specific details settle like dust in a room after the cleaning is done, after the housemaid has gone and the door is closed and the room is empty and perfect and still. Ellen is asleep in the attic. The range is banked. The keys are on the housekeeper's hook. The silver is locked in the butler's pantry. The linen is folded in its cupboard. The bells are still on their indicators, their labels and copperplate, waiting for morning. Morning is a long way away. You have hours. Let the story go. Let the house go, the Victorian house with its two halves, its back staircase and its front door, its invisible labor and its visible grace. Let it all dissolve into the warm dark behind your eyes. You are in your own room, in your own time, in the particular comfort of wherever you have arranged yourself for this evening. The sounds around you are familiar. The weight of the blanket or the duvet or whatever covers you is right. The darkness is the darkness you know. Nothing is required of you now. Nothing needs doing. Everything that needed doing today has been done, and everything that needs doing tomorrow can wait until tomorrow, which is far away and will arrive in its own time without your help. Let your breathing slow. Let the day's thoughts release, the obligations, the concerns, the small unfinished things, and go soft, go loose, go quiet. The house at rest. The night at its deepest. The morning nowhere near. Sleep now. Thank you so much for spending this evening here. If you found this story restful, if something in it stayed with you, some small detail about the back staircase or the banked range or the housemaid carrying her hot water cans up the servants' stairs before the city woke, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps us keep making these stories, and there are many more waiting. See you next time. Sleep well. Did you have a grandmother or great-grandmother who was in domestic service? Or have you ever lived in or visited an old house where you could feel the presence of the people who worked in it, the worn tread of a back staircase, a row of old bells in a corridor? I would genuinely love to hear your stories in the comments.